Chapter 1576. Perhaps, this was the last time she would care about him openly. The next time they met, she would be his enemy. She was the person he hated the most. Qin Anlin's body leaned against the backrest. He was wearing a black shirt with 2 buttons undone and a trench coat of the same color. He reminded her of the old Qin Anlin. She didn't know when, but he had toned down his aura. Now, it was all gone. She felt a little sad in her heart, but this kind of sadness was her own choice. He had indeed lost a lot of weight, but she had lost even more weight. Other than this, don't you have anything else to say to me? He took out a cigarette and put it on his lips. He didn't light it up and just stared at her. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips, lowered her eyes, and looked at him with a pleading gaze. Is Mu Yun okay? He took the cigarette down and stared at her for a long time before asking sternly, Yi Liangqiu, do you remember that you are Mu Yun's mother? Do you remember that you are carrying my child? If you remember, you won't treat yourself so cruelly and force me. Qin Anlin's handsome face looked at her, and his Adam's apple couldn't help moving. She was still looking at him with a pleading gaze. Qin Anlin pursed his thin lips and smiled coldly. When you think it through, you can ask Mu Yun, okay? She knew what he meant. If she didn't tell the truth, he would be cruel to her, and she might never see Mu Yun in this lifetime. At that moment, she hesitated, but in the end, she still gave up. Once you've decided, Yi Liangqiu, you have to do it. You can't give up because of a moment of soft-heartedness and become weak. I've said everything I should say. She opened her mouth bitterly, her thin white fingers intertwining gently, pretending that one hand was his. She looked up at him with a passionate gaze. In the future, could they still be together? After she had turned her back on him, after he had hated her so much. Yi Liangqiu did not know. She only knew that she could no longer turn back. If he gave up now, Qin Pei would lose his life, Anlin's mother would not be able to rest in peace, and Anlin would suffer for the rest of his life. Between them was the crime that Su Shicheng had done to his mother. Would they be happy? No, even if she said it out, they would not be happy. Anlin couldn't go, because that was his mother. Qin Anlin looked at her and said slowly, I'll give you 3 more days. He got up and walked towards the door. Yi Liangqiu looked at his back and felt a sense of melancholy. Anlin. She softly called his name, a bit hurried. He looked back at her with a cold expression and said word by word, Miss Yi, worry about yourself because you might be charged with murder. She pursed her lips and her face was a little pale. Then, she chuckled. Thank you for your reminder. You don't need to thank me. This is a warning. He looked at her deeply. He looked at her, sitting there in a blue dress, looking haggard. This was his newlywed wife, but at this moment, she was like a passerby. He felt a little sad and immediately turned around to walk outside. When he was outside, his eyes felt a little hot, and he blinked a few times before closing them. Chapter 1577. Qin Anlin slowly opened his eyes, turned around, and looked at the house behind him. After looking at it for a long time, he got into the car. Keim followed him. His heart was also heavy, because not long ago, Su Cheng had also gone in once. Keim tilted his head and looked at Qin Anlin's cold face. He said softly, since you care, why don't you take it slow? I believe that Miss Yi wouldn't do such a thing. Qin Anlin was silent for a long time before he said, I can give in to anything, but not this. His mother had turned into ashes in an instant. She had hidden it for Su Shicheng, so he couldn't live with her anymore. He couldn't face her face, and he couldn't face his mother in the underworld. However, he still couldn't be cruel to her. He even cared if she ate well in there, and whether she could sleep or not. He hated himself for being like this. He lied to himself and told himself that it was all because of the child in her stomach. But in the dead of night, he still missed her. He hated himself. Kaim sighed and didn't dare to say anything else. Saying too much wouldn't change anything. The car slowly drove to the apartment, and Qin Anlin sat in the car for a long time. Kaim's voice was very soft. President Qin. Go back to the company first. Call me if you need anything, Qin Anlin said as he opened the car door and got out. He took the elevator to the top floor. Mu Yun was at home, and Qingxiu was taking care of the child. After the old lady passed away, Qingxiu didn't eat or drink all day, and she kept talking about the old lady. It couldn't go on like this, so Qin Anlin still brought Qingxiu and Mu Yun here. He said that he wanted her to take care of Mu Yun, but in fact, it was just to give her spiritual sustenance. Qin Anlin didn't go in immediately. Instead, he smoked outside before walking in. As soon as he opened the door, he saw an unexpected guest sitting on the sofa, Xia Mian. Qin Anlin held the door with his hand and didn't close it. He quietly looked at the girl sitting there. For a moment, he thought it was Liangqiu. Liangqiu, who was a few years younger, came back, but when they saw her clearly, it was Xia Mian. Xia Mian was sitting on the sofa in a white dress, playing aeroplane with Mu Yun. Her expression was especially pure, and the way she looked at Mu Yun was also very kind. Qin Anlin leaned against the door and said in a cold voice, Miss Xia, no one invited you here. Xia Mian raised her eyes and looked at Qin Anlin. After a while, she said bitterly, I just wanted to take a look. As she spoke, she twisted her slender fingers helplessly. Qin Anlin had seen many women, but he was still cold. What are you looking at? I came to see if the house is short of a mistress, isn't it? I didn't. Xia Mian's voice was urgent as she stood up. Her face was tense as she said firmly, President Qin, I'm not the kind of person you think I am. I just came from my hometown. I heard that something happened to your family, so I came to show my concern. I have no ulterior motives. Miss Xia, let me remind you again. Qin Anlin seemed to be unable to bear it. We don't have any friendship. We just know each other. Do you understand? I don't want you to disturb my life anymore. Xia Mian's face became even paler. Her lips moved, but she couldn't say anything for a long time. After a long time, she lowered her head and said awkwardly, I'll leave immediately. Chapter 1578. Xia Mian picked up a denim jacket from the sofa and said in a low voice, Don't bother, Aunt Su. I'll go back to the dorm to eat. Su Qiuxiu untied the apron, glanced at Qin Anlin, and said slowly, I asked Miss Xia to stay for dinner. This child came to see us early in the morning, so it's not too much to ask for a meal. Qin Anlin had always respected Su Qiuxiu, especially when the old lady passed away. Su Qiuxiu's grief was no less than his. At this time, how could he not give her face? So he didn't say anything and went straight to the bedroom to change. He wore a pair of coffee-colored casual pants with a white sweater on top. It was very homey. Plus, he had lost weight recently, so he looked melancholy. Xia Mian's face was a little hot. She didn't dare to look at him and turned her little face away. Qin Anlin carried Mu Yun to the dining chair, and Su Qiuxiu said to Xia Mian, Miss Xia, let's sit together. Xia Mian carefully sat in the last seat, and she looked a little uncomfortable. She didn't come from a good family, so she wasn't used to everything here. Although she had been in and out of some places, she still felt uncomfortable now. When she passed by the master bedroom, she secretly saw a huge photo of Yi Liangqiu. There was also the super big bed. Her mind was filled with the scene of them doing that kind of thing on the bed. She couldn't get rid of it. Xia Mian looked at it for a long time, and her heart was filled with deep jealousy. She looked up and picked up a piece of braised pork for little Mu Yun. Good boy, eat more. Eat more to gain weight. Yi Mu Yun didn't eat, but looked at Xia Mian. Public chopsticks. Xia Mian was stunned and couldn't help but say, What? Don't you have saliva on your chopsticks? Yi Muyun's voice was just as impatient as Qin Anlin's. Only then did Xia Mian understand what he meant. Her face was a little red, and she quickly put the piece of meat back into her bowl and picked up a pair of public chopsticks. Also, I don't like meat. Yi Muyun's voice was a little cold. It didn't sound like a 7 or 8-year-old kid at all. To Xia Mian, it sounded a little difficult to deal with. Little Mu Yun was quite well behaved and easy to get along with when she played with him previously. She was put on the spot and her face was pale. She looked at Su Xiu for help. Aunt Su. I originally thought that you were here to apply to be a nanny, Xiao Muyun said straightforwardly. She was not too polite. Qin Anlin didn't stop him. Originally, little Mu Yun's idea was also his. He was very dissatisfied with the sudden appearance of a woman, but he could not do anything about it. Therefore, he did not correct his son's impoliteness, but rejoiced instead. Crispy Sleeve gently stroked Mu Yun's hair. You can't be so rude. Sister Xia Mian came to see us. Did she come to see Dad? Does she want to be my new mother? Yi Muyun's voice was merciless, and it wasn't as sharp as a child's. Tears were already welling up in Xia Mian's eyes. After a long time, she said softly, President Qin, I'd better leave first. Su Xiu didn't quite agree. Qin Anlin just said faintly, I'll see Miss Xia off. He thought that he still had something to say to her. He didn't want to face and deal with her, but in order to avoid trouble in the future, he wanted to make it clear to her. Xia Mian was a little surprised, and her eyes lit up. However, when she looked into his eyes, the light quickly dimmed. Chapter 1579. Qin Anlin's eyes were a little gloomy. Miss Xia, I'd better walk you out. His tone was a little domineering. Then, he opened the door and walked out first. Xia Mian had no choice, so she pursed her lips and followed him out. Outside the door, Qin Anlin was leaning against the elevator. His chin was a little blue, and he looked unprecedentedly dispirited and tired. Xia Mian walked over slowly until she was about 2 steps away from him. President Qin. Let's go. He didn't look at her and directly pressed the button for the elevator. Xia Mian followed him into the elevator uneasily. The mirror in the elevator reflected their figures. Xia Mian's eyes were a little misty as she looked at them. At this time, he was almost single. He had been abandoned by Yu Yangqiu, so why couldn't she take advantage of this opportunity? She told herself that if she lost this chance, she might never have another chance. Mr. Qin. She bit her lip and suddenly had the courage to say, I like you. As if she was afraid that he would overthink it, she added, just because you're Qin Anlin, and nothing else. Qin Anlin looked in the direction of the elevator door. He heard her words but didn't respond immediately. After about 5 seconds, the elevator reached the first floor. He walked over and pressed the elevator button, saying faintly, Miss Xia, don't come here anymore. He didn't even reply, treating her as if she were air, dispensable. Xia Mian was a bit shocked. In her opinion, he should be the one being comforted the most at this moment, but when he was facing her, facing a face that resembled Yu Yangqiu's, he was indifferent. His performance was impeccable. Xia Mian was embarrassed again. Unwilling to give up, she quickly grabbed his arm and looked up at him. I want to be with you. Qin Anlin looked down at her hand that was touching him. After a moment, he reached out and took her hand away. His voice was still indifferent. I have a wife. Miss Xia, please behave yourself. But Xia Mian didn't want to give up. She looked up and said emotionally, why? How could she still be your wife? How could she do such a thing? Qin Anlin suddenly grabbed her hand, and with a loud bang, Xia Mian's body was thrown against the wall of the elevator. His body pressed against hers tightly, almost squeezing all the air out of her lungs. He looked down at her coldly and pinched her chin with one hand. He lowers his head. Jun Yen is very close to her. The breath coming out of his thin lips is also cold. What qualifications do you have to say about her? Just because you've seen me a few times, just because you're young and good-looking. Xia Mian breathed as hard as she could. Her chest heaved up and down violently. She looked at the man in front of her. No, at this moment, he was as cold as the Grim Reaper. But this kind of coldness was desperately attracting her. She couldn't resist. No. She shook her head and suddenly hugged his shoulders. I want to love you, I want to take care of you. Really, I don't want a title. I can even help you take care of Mu Yun. His eyes narrowed, and one hand moved downwards. Xia Mian gasped. She never thought that Qin Anlin would do something like this to her, let alone in the elevator. She trembled, but she didn't refuse. He stared into her eyes and said slowly, Xia Mian, this is what you want, isn't it? She desperately shook her head and nodded, her eyes full of tears. Chapter 1580. However, in just 2 seconds, Qin Anlin let go of her and stepped back completely. His eyes were filled with coldness, and the corner of his mouth was curled into a sneer. To me, a woman like this is just a prostitute. Xia Mian's body fell against the wall of the elevator, her fingers pressed against the cold wall behind her. She should have left. She had been deeply insulted by him. He had only touched her twice, but he had said that she was no different from that kind of woman. Xia Mian was arrogant, but this kind of arrogance was completely lost in front of Qin Anlin. She lightly gasped, then gently stepped forward and reached out to stroke Qin Anlin's forehead comfortingly. I don't care. I just want you to be happy. Her hand was pushed away, and her body hit the wall again. This time, he just looked at her coldly. Do I need it just because you gave it to me? His thin lips were tightly pursed, and his voice was stern. Miss Xia, go back to your own world. Don't provoke me, or I will make it impossible for you to survive in B City. Xia Mian blinked and finally blinked back her tears. She also finally understood that the man in front of her didn't need her. He wasn't being unreasonable, he wasn't playing hard to get, and he wasn't playing tricks. He really didn't like her. She didn't understand why he didn't like her. She clearly looked like that person. But in the end, he still left without any reluctance. He only treated her as air, or even as trash. Qin Anlin smoked a few cigarettes outside before going back. When he walked in, Crispy Sleeve was busy in the kitchen, and Yi Muyun was sitting on the sofa, looking a little lonely. Since the incident, the little guy hadn't asked anything. Just looking at him made Qin Anlin think of Yi Liangqiu, and his heart ached a little. He slowly walked over, reached out to pick up his son, and pressed the little head into his arms. Little Mu Yun buried his head, and his little hands quietly hugged his waist. This small action let Qin Anlin know that the little guy was actually feeling uneasy. He didn't say anything, but it didn't mean that Mu Yun didn't think about it. Why did you play with her before? He asked Xia Mian in a low voice. Judging from Yi Muyun's attitude towards Xia Mian, it was obvious that he didn't like her. However, little Mu Yun got along well with Xia Mian. The little girl in his arms said in a muffled voice, I just want to see that face. Will Daddy like her because she looks like Mommy? Qin Anlin's heart was wet. He reached out to rub his son's hair and said in a hoarse voice, No. Daddy won't like her. Little Mu Yun buried his head in his father's arms again. After a while, he asked softly, Does Daddy still like Mommy? This time, Qin Anlin didn't answer him immediately. He sighed slightly and rubbed his son's hair without saying anything. Crispy Sleeve came out of the kitchen and was stunned when she saw the father and son. Then he asked slowly, Has Miss Xia left? Qin Anlin patted his son in his arms and grunted. Then he said, Don't let her in the future. She doesn't have many people to interact with. Crispy Sleeve was stunned, and then she said slowly, At this time, it's good that Mu Yun can interact with some people. Besides, Anlin, you should also think about the future. How could Qin Anlin not hear the strong hint in her words? Not only did he not think about it, but he also disagreed with it. He frowned and said, Aunt Su, don't say this in front of Mu Yun. Chapter 1581. But Qingxiu didn't think much of it. We'll have to talk about it publicly in the future. In her heart, Yi Liangqiu was a good person and Anlin loved her very much. But she had married into the Qin family, and now that old madam had met with such a huge incident, if her heart wasn't on Anlin's side, it would mean that she had made a choice. What was Anlin still hesitating about? If he cut ties with her now, it would be beneficial to him and King Entertainment. She also knew that Anlin still had hope in his heart and was still giving her a chance. But after so many days, as long as Yi Liangqiu had some guts, she would have stood up and said something. She felt pity that old madam had doted on the wrong person for nothing. Now that she was old, she didn't even get to see her son. Qingxiu didn't hate Yi Liangqiu that much, but she blamed her. At this moment, Anlin's heart was in pain. If Anlin and Miss Xia were together, it would be a temporary comfort. Qin Anlin's voice was a little cold. Auntie Su, I've never said that before. About the divorce. Qingxiu wanted to say something, but she didn't dare to continue when she saw his expression. Although he treated her like family, she was still a subordinate. Little Mu Yun looked at his father and pursed his lips. After a while, he asked softly, Daddy, will you divorce Mommy? Qin Anlin looked down at his son and smiled. No. Little Mu Yun didn't dare to ask for his mother. He knew that if he were to pester him, it would only make his father upset. Qingxiu sighed and returned to her room. 3 days later, at the detention center. Qin Anlin walked slowly into the guest room. Yi Liangqiu was already sitting there. It had been 3 days since they last met and she hadn't changed much. She was still fine. Qin Anlin sat down and looked at her deeply. Have you thought it through? Yi Liangqiu's gaze was even more fervent than his. There was a look of nostalgia on her face. She looked at him quietly for a long time before saying, I've already found a lawyer. That short sentence made him disappointed and even despair. He closed his eyes slightly, and his voice seemed to have aged 10 years. Yi Liangqiu, have you thought it through? Anlin, I'm sorry. She looked at him, not willing to look away for even a second. Qin Anlin slowly opened his eyes, which seemed to be frozen. He looked at her, at the woman he had once loved deeply, and laughed coldly. Are the words you've said, the feelings you've given, are they all fake? He had never been so humble before. This woman had clearly made her choice, but he still wanted to save her. Yi Liangqiu raised her head and said in a choked voice, Anlin, it was true in the past, and it will be true in the present and in the future. Anlin, I don't have a way, I don't have a way. If I had a way, I wouldn't have let you be sad and desperate. Qin Pei is still in Su Shiqing's hands. As long as I say a word, he will immediately be killed. Anlin, I'm sorry. I know it's very difficult, but I still have to do it, even if I have to pay a price 100 times worse than I imagined. Qin Anlin suddenly laughed. He lit a cigarette and looked at her through the smoke. What about the child? Are you going to give birth to her in prison? Her lips trembled slightly as she looked at him. Chapter 1582. Yi Liangqiu closed her eyes. Anlin, will you really let me go to jail? I don't believe you. She sighed. Qin Anlin held one of her hands and raised it high. He looked at her and said coldly, You don't believe me? Yi Liangqiu, we can try. Her hand hurt from his grip. When she opened her eyes were filled with tears, as though stars had fallen from the sky. However, he didn't want to see those eyes again. He let go of her hand and got up slowly. With a bitter smile, he said, Let's do it this way. Yi Liangqiu. He wanted to go out, but he paused. I'll get my lawyer to file a lawsuit. If you want to go to jail, then I'll think of a comfortable environment for you like Kime. I'll pick you up after you give birth to the child. With that, he paused. After a long time, he continued, but it's impossible for us. He stood ramrod straight, his silhouette completely desolate. Yi Liangxiu looked at his back view. He suddenly turned around and looked at her. Yi Liangxiu, why did you provoke me? Since you said you loved me, why did you give up? After my heart was filled with you, you cruelly told me that I wasn't the most important and cruelly forced me to let go of your hand. He didn't want an answer from her. He just wanted to say it to her. Their eyes met. After a while, he didn't say anything else and walked out. The door of the detention center closed with a squeak. When he shut the last ray of sunlight outside, she couldn't hold back her tears any longer. He said, Yi Liangxiu, it's impossible for us to be together. He said, why did you provoke me? Yi Liangxiu, this is the outcome you've already thought of. Why do you still feel so upset? Autumn went and autumn came. Yi Liangxiu's trial was 2 months later. She was already 6 months pregnant. She stood in court with a huge belly. Qin Anlin was sitting on the plaintiff's side, looking at her expressionlessly. He looked at her inconvenience, almost like she was clumsy. His heart ached. He had never wanted her to go to jail. He was just forcing her to tell the truth. Yi Liangxiu placed her hand on her abdomen. While she was in the detention center, she still had regular prenatal checkups. The child in her belly was still doing well, but something unexpected happened. When her defense lawyer came over, Qin Anlin was shocked. Lu Jinyun. 10 years ago, he developed his career in the United States. Later, he returned to B City and opened a law firm. He was one of the top lawyers in the country. He cherished his reputation very much and generally did not appear in such criminal cases. Yi Liangxiu could not invite him, and it was even more impossible for Su Shicheng. Qin Anlin's mood was very complicated, but he was still calm. Kime whispered, I've checked. It was Mr. Tang who asked lawyer Lu to come out. Tang Yu? Qin Anlin's gaze fell on Yi Liangxiu's face again. Yi Liangxiu pursed her lips and did not say anything. Kime whispered again, if President Qin is not confident, you can apply to postpone the trial. He was just testing the waters. It was not his original intention. Qin Anlin said calmly, there's no need for that. Kime heaved a sigh of relief. He looked at Yi Liangxiu with mixed feelings. With Lu Jinyun's help, the case became much easier to argue. Everyone in the courtroom had witnessed his various methods. Yi Liangxiu was sued, but because there was insufficient evidence, she was released on the spot. Chapter 1583. He didn't understand why Tang Yu wanted to help Yi Liangxiu. When Yi Liangxiu walked out of the courtroom, she looked at Lu Jinyun and said softly, thank you, lawyer Lu. Actually, I'm very expensive. Mr. Tang paid me 50 million yuan to fight this case and get you out of prison. Lu Jinyun said bluntly. Yi Liangxiu was stunned. Lawyer Lu had never said that before. Lu Jinyun smiled slightly. Mr. Tang's wife is in the car in front. You can ask them about the details. In the end, he reached out his hand. Anyway, I still congratulate you on regaining your freedom. Lu Jinyun was 35 years old. He was gentle and elegant. He was a famous bachelor in B City. He had a good reputation and had no bad records. He turned around and opened his car door. Suddenly, he turned around and looked at her. Miss Yi, I like your movie very much. After saying that, he opened the white Bentley and got into the car. Yi Liangxiu didn't understand why he said that to her. She also didn't know that Lu Jinyun took this case not only because of Tang Yu, but also because he was her fan. She watched his car drive away with a profound look in her eyes. After a long time, she turned around and saw a black Rolls-Royce Phantom. The door opened and Pei Chi-Chi got out of the car. She held the door with one hand to prevent her head from hitting it. Yi Liangqiu's eyes were a little hot. She watched Tang Yu get out of the car. "Thank you, Mr. Tang." She looked at him and then her eyes fell on Pei Chi-Chi's face. She knew that they had also gone through a lot of hardships to be together. Would her Anlin have such a day? Would she be able to return to Anlin in the future? Would she be able to lie under his body and bear his love? She didn't know, and she didn't dare to think about it. Tang Yu nodded. He looked at her, then looked at Qin Anlin, who walked out of the courtroom. Then he instructed Pei Chi-Chi, "Chi-Chi, take her to Xia City first." Yi Liangqiu looked up and saw Qin Anlin over there. Pei Chi-Chi gently pulled her. "Let's go. Anlin looks like he wants to eat someone." Tang Yu looked at his wife helplessly and said, "Miss Yi, leave with Chi-Chi first." Yi Liangqiu got into the car in a daze. The black limousine started slowly and she saw Anlin. However, the car soon left and could not be seen. She was a little worried. "Will Mr. Tang be in trouble?" Pei Chi-Chi casually said, "I won't." She secretly stuck out her tongue. At most, it would be a fight. After all, they had fought many times. In fact, some words were not easy to say. It seemed that Tang Yu helped Yi Liangqiu on the surface, but in fact, it was Qin Anlin who let her go. If Anlin didn't love her and was cruel, then Liangqiu couldn't stand the torture. Everyone knew this. It was just that Liangqiu didn't know it and Anlin didn't want to admit it. On the other side, Qin Anlin stepped forward and gave Tang Yu a punch. Tang Yu took such a blow to vent his anger. He took a few steps back, straightened his body, and wiped the corner of his mouth. It was bleeding. What a hard punch. Why did you do this? Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes. You knew that my mother's death had something to do with Mr. Su. Chapter 1584. How do you know that I want to let her go? Qin Anlin's face was full of coldness. Tang Yu, get out of my way. Don't block my way, or I won't let you go either. Tang Yu was wearing home clothes, as if he had just crawled out of bed at home. His voice was indifferent. I'm right here. If you don't want to let me go, then hurry up. Even Qin Anlin, who knew Tang Yu so well, had never thought that Tang Yu would become so shameless. He clasped his hands. It seems that we can only talk with our fists. Tang Yu held his chin with his fingers and frowned. I really don't like such a violent method. He took 2 steps back and clenched his fists. But if you like, we can still do some exercise together. Qin Anlin was a little confused. At this time, the most serious Tang Yu had become delusional. Thus, the two of them fought for the 3rd time. The first 2 fights were for Pei Chi-Chi, and this time, it was for Yi Liangqiu. Tang Yu was mainly in defense. As long as his handsome face wasn't hit, it would be fine. That face could seduce his little Chi-Chi at any time. If it was ruined, what would he use to attract her? Qin Anlin's fists hit flesh. In the end, he probably realized that Tang Yu wanted to let him win. His eyes were red and he stopped. Tang Yu, you don't have to do this. If you want to make me feel better, don't interfere between me and Yi Liangqiu. His voice was cold. It's impossible for me and her to be together in this lifetime. How could he not know what Tang Yu was thinking? Tang Yu saved Liangqiu just to give them one last chance. One last chance to be together. If Liangqiu was in jail, it would be impossible for them. Tang Yu stood up slowly and sighed slightly. He walked over and patted his shoulder. Anlin, since you know it clearly, why do you still insist on treating her like this? They clearly still had feelings for each other. Qin Anlin took out a cigarette and lit it. After taking a puff, he looked at Tang Yu faintly. If it were you, how would you treat Chi-Chi? This was exactly what Tang Yu could not answer. After a long time, he sighed and said, Anlin, I believe that she will not betray you. But she did it. Qin Anlin sneered. Tang Yu, what can I do? Take her back and continue to be a loving couple? How can I face my mother? Tang Yu wanted to say something, but Qin Anlin had already punched Tang Yu's lower abdomen. It was so painful that he broke out in a cold sweat. You're so ruthless. Tang Yu bent over and his forehead was full of cold sweat. He felt that he was about to be crippled. His married life with Chi-Chi was probably going to be ruined. And Qin Anlin had already gotten in the car and drove away quickly. He knew very well where Tang Yu would take Yi Liangqiu. It must be Xia City. Half an hour later, he appeared at the gate of Xia City. It was Pei Chi-Chi who opened the door. She looked at the person and opened her mouth slightly in surprise. Anlin. Then she instinctively wanted to close the door, but it was too late. Qin Anlin had already pushed her away. Get out of the way. Where is Yi Liangqiu? Pei Chi-Chi bumped into the door and her little nose was almost flattened. But she immediately ran over to stop him. Anlin, calm down. Get out of the way. Qin Anlin said coldly. He was not polite to her. Pei Chi-Chi pursed her lips. No way. Qin Anlin, she is now 6 months pregnant. You can't do this to her. Qin Anlin smiled coldly. She doesn't even care about the child. Chapter 1585. Pei Chi-Chi hugged his waist from behind and hung on him like a little monkey, looking a little ridiculous. Qin Anlin paused and said in a deep voice, let go of Chi-Chi. I'm not letting go. She said roguishly, still hugging his waist and burying her face in his back. She hurriedly said, Anlin, did you forget how much you loved her in the past? Did you forget how you two started? In order to give birth to Muyun, she lived in the south for so many years. Feeling his body soften a little and not as stiff as before, she mumbled, Anlin, have you forgotten all of that? Chi-Chi, let go. Qin Anlin's voice was hoarse. I wouldn't be like this today if I forgot. Yi Liangqiu would have died 100 times over. Pei Chi-Chi was still hugging him tightly. Then what are you going to do to her? Did you kill her? She ran in front of him and stopped him. Don't forget that she's pregnant with your child. Qin Anlin stared at her and said, Chi-Chi, don't interfere in my business with her. I don't care. I just want to interfere. Pei Chi-Chi's eyes were watery. Anlin, I know you're sad, but I'm more afraid that you'll regret it in the future. She said with a choked voice. I don't care about you. Who cares about you? She actually started crying like a child. She had feelings for him after living in New York for 2 years. Although they weren't husband and wife, he was like her brother. She felt guilty that he sent her back to Tang Yu's side in one piece. Fortunately, he was also happy. But now, he was destroying that happiness. Liangqiu loved him more than anyone else. It was hatred that blinded his eyes, making him unable to see himself and Liangqiu's heart clearly. Anlin. She hugged him like an octopus. Qin Anlin's heart was also heavy. He lowered his head, looked at her and smiled bitterly. Chi-Chi, you're not me. You can't understand how I feel. I understand. She looked up at him. I'm the same as Liangqiu. I've done terrible things, and hurt others. Anlin, if she's really like what you think, she just cares and doesn't want to see that person's last days end in prison. Anlin, if that person is going to die, you can use other methods, can't you? Pei Chi-Chi was afraid that he would go to the room to look for Yi Liangqiu again, so she simply hooked her legs around him, not giving him a chance to move. This kind of attitude was really inelegant. But she couldn't care less. Qin Anlin's gaze lowered. Then, he decisively plucked the little person from his arms and threw her on the sofa. When she bounced up, he quickly tore off his tie and tied her feet, then threw her on the sofa. Qin Anlin. Don't go in, you'll regret it. Pei Chi lay there pathetically, and her voice was the same. Also, this is my home. My home. But Qin Anlin ignored her and directly opened the door to the master bedroom. Because the soundproofing was too good, Yi Liangqiu, who was showering in the master bedroom, didn't know that he had come. So when he suddenly opened the bathroom door, both of them were stunned. Her 6-month-old belly was so big that it looked like it was going to be full term. She stood there, the light shining on her body, making her pregnant body look even more holy. Chapter 1586. His eyes were burning as he stared at her and didn't say a word for a long time. Yi Liangqiu quickly grabbed a large towel and wrapped it around himself. His body retreated until he was pressed against the cold wall. His voice was suppressed as he said, "Put on your clothes." She still didn't say anything and just looked at his face as if a storm was brewing. Qin Anlin's Adam's apple bobbed as he walked forward step by step. Her body was against the wall, and her red lips were trembling slightly. His gaze was fixed on her body. Although her stomach was big, she was thin and her legs were too thin. She looked like a frog, but she was still seductive. Finally, his palm touched her stomach and he said in a hoarse voice, "Where are the clothes?" She shook her head and wanted to scream, but she couldn't say a word. Qin Anlin looked around and finally didn't care. He took Tang Yu's shirt and coat from the changing room and put it on her. This action of his caused Yi Liangqiu's heart to sink completely. A man letting his woman wear another man's clothes meant that he didn't care anymore. He really didn't want her anymore and hated her. She didn't resist anymore and let him put it on for her. There wasn't even a trace of life in her eyes. "Let's go." He held her hand without pity and walked towards the door. His pace was not slow. It was difficult for a pregnant woman who was 6 months pregnant, but it was obvious that he didn't care anymore. When they passed by the living room, Pei Chi was still lying on the ground and crying. "Anlin, let go of her. If you want to take her, take me. I'll help you get rid of that old bastard." Qin Anlin stopped in his tracks, and Yi Liangqiu was forced to stop as well. She fell into his arms due to inertia, and his long-lost scent enveloped him. His gaze fell on Pei Chi's face, and he just smiled coldly. "Pei Chi, you've grown up." As he spoke, he lowered his head and glanced at Yi Liangqiu. His eyes were cold as if they had been frozen. Yi Liangqiu said faintly, "Let go of her. Worry more about yourself. Tang Yu will be back in a while." The latter words were directed at Pei Chi. As he spoke, he walked towards the door. Yi Liangqiu was almost dragged away by him. Pei Chi's sadness was all fed to the dogs. She scolded, "Qin Anlin, you bastard. You deserve to be single for the rest of your life. That's your wife. She's pregnant with your son." But what answered her was the sound of a door being slammed. Pei Chi started crying again. Wah, let me go. I need to go to the bathroom." In less than 5 minutes, Tang Yu opened the door, walked over quickly, picked her up, and untied her tie. "Where's Yi Liangqiu?" Anlin took her away. Pei Chi cried out and hugged her husband. "Tang Yu, Liangqiu is so pitiful. Can you bring her back?" Tang Yu felt that the little girl in his arms was so soft. Ever since she fell into the water and lost her memory, she had been like this. Actually, she had remembered, but her personality had always been like this. She didn't look like she was 27 or 28 years old. She seemed even younger than when he first met her. However, he was willing to dote on her and let her have her way. If it were any other time, he would have doted on her and hugged her. But now, he had something else on his mind. Chapter 1587. Tang Yu patted her. "I think there must be something troubling Yi Liangqiu, and she can't tell anyone about it." Pei Chi looked at her husband, her big eyes full of admiration. "And then?" There's nothing else. He reached out and rubbed her little feet. It's so hard to talk to a little fool like you. I think she's being threatened. A threat that even Anlin can't solve. He suddenly said, Chi-Chi, do you believe in Yu Yangqiu? Oh, Pei Chi-Chi replied ambiguously. Liangqiu is one of the few women I admire. He rubbed his little wife's little head lovingly. Pei Chi-Chi had recently realized that whenever Tang Yu showed such a loving expression, it meant that he wanted to dote on her. But she wasn't in the mood now. She knelt in front of him and didn't care about letting him rub her feet. She asked eagerly, who else do you admire? Tang Yu was amused. He reached out and touched his handsome chin. My mother. Who else? Pei Chi-Chi's eyes were twinkling. She couldn't be jealous of her mother-in-law. Tang Yu pretended to be troubled. What else? I don't think so. Pei Chi-Chi grumbled unhappily, that's all. Aren't there any outstanding women around you? Around me? Tang Yu thought for a moment. Being careful isn't bad. Pei Chi-Chi was furious. What about me, what about me, what about me? Aren't you going to consider me? Tang Yu reached out and pinched her little face. You don't need to be outstanding. Because no matter what you are, I like you. Liking is not admiring, and she didn't need other men to admire her. It was enough as long as he liked her. This was considered his best sweet talk, but Pei Chi-Chi took a long time to understand it. Then, she blushed slightly and pouted. That's more like it. He picked her up and walked to the bedroom. She didn't know what he wanted to do before, but now she knew. Pei Chi-Chi was furious. I have to save Liangqiu. I'm only responsible for keeping her out of jail. I think she has her own plans in the future. Under my protection, she and Anlin will never be able to be together. Tang Yu reached out to touch her lips. Now, Chi-Chi, don't speak. Pei Chi-Chi shouted, anyway, I will never call you brother again today. This pervert. Every time he did this kind of thing, he would force her to call him brother. After that, she thought that he would let her go. Who knew that it was as if he was on steroids? She would not be fooled. All right, don't call me brother, call me daddy. He smiled. While Xiaoxin isn't around, Chi-Chi, do whatever you want. He had hit the nail on the head. Pei Chi-Chi bit her lips. I don't want to. But after a while, she climbed into his arms. Before the feast, she still asked worriedly, Anlin won't do anything to Liangqiu, right? Pei Chi-Chi, instead of worrying about others, you should worry about yourself. Tang Yu sealed her little mouth and ended the topic. He didn't tell his Chi-Chi that he had deliberately let Anlin take Liangqiu away. Otherwise, with Anlin's skills, he wouldn't be able to touch him at all. Pei Chi-Chi was a little dazzled by his kiss. Her little hand hung around his neck. Will you help Liangqiu then? Tang Yu smiled. He could predict what would happen in the future. He sighed. Probably Anlin will end our friendship. You have a friendship with him? Pei Chi-Chi looked at him in disdain. Chapter 1588. Qin Anlin threw Yu Yangqiu into the back seat of the car. When she was about to escape, he held the car door with his hand, bent over, and looked straight at her. If you don't want to lose your child, you'd better not think about escaping. With that, he slammed the door and got into the car himself. When he buckled the seatbelt, Yu Yangqiu's voice was a little soft. Where are we going? Her voice was trembling because of nervousness. Qin Anlin's voice was very slow. Just now, Pei Chi-Chi said that there's another way, which is, for me to kill Su Shiqing myself. I think this idea is very good. No. Yu Yangqiu's voice had a hint of surprise in it. Anlin, don't. Once he did that, Anlin's father would probably be dead before Su Shiqing died. Su Shiqing hid Qin Pei very well, and no one knew where he was. So for so many years, no one knew that Qin Pei was imprisoned in City B. Qin Anlin put his hands on the steering wheel and smiled coldly. Why? Can't bear to part with him? His voice was very cold. Yi Liangqiu, but I insisted on doing this. The high-performance sports car started and sped up at the fastest speed. Yi Liangqiu sat there, her face a little pale. She held the armrest with her hand and closed her eyes. This was their reunion after a long time, and it was very painful. She couldn't stop what he wanted to do. But she didn't expect that Qin Anlin wasn't alone. Soon, she saw about 5 or 6 black business cars following their car in the rearview mirror. She panted lightly as she looked at Qin Anlin's back. Anlin, what do you want to do? He had been prepared. There was a realization that almost made her breathless. He knew that she wouldn't go to jail, and he had long wanted to solve it in this way. Qin Anlin's car suddenly slowed down by the street. She seemed to have realized something. Panting, she looked at him. Anlin, don't go. Qin Anlin sat quietly for a while and said calmly, Liangqiu, our fate is over. I might not be able to fulfill my promise to you at the wedding. He paused, but Su Shicheng, I must kill him. If I don't come back, take good care of Mu Yun. It was the first time in months that he had spoken to her so gently, as if she were still his wife. But when she heard it, she felt even sadder. This was his farewell to her, a matter of life and death. Yi Liangqiu shook her head. Don't go, Anlin. Then, will you tell the truth? Let the law punish Su Shicheng. He turned slightly and looked at her calmly. Yi Liangqiu shook her head. Anlin, it's not like that. It's not that simple. Tell me why. He was giving her one last chance. He told her in his heart. Yi Liangqiu was stunned. She knew what he was thinking, but she couldn't. If she told the truth, it would definitely lead to Lady Qin's humiliation, not to mention Qin Pei's life. She was silent for a long time before saying softly, Anlin, I'm begging you. He doesn't have many years left. God will deal with him. But I'd rather do it myself. Qin Anlin's voice became cold. Then, he opened the car door and got out, opening the door for her. Yi Liangqiu was brought out of the car by him. Kaim got out of the car by the side. Qin Anlin handed Yi Liangqiu to him. Kaim, look after her. He only trusted Kaim. Chapter 1589. Kaim knew very well how important Yi Liangqiu was in President Qin's heart. Even after such a big thing happened, Chairman Qin still couldn't let it go. He said heartless words and even made Yi Liangqiu suffer a lot. However, when it came to life and death, he still couldn't bear it. Kaim nodded. Miss Yi, I'll send you away. In fact, President Qin had already written his will. No one knew if he would live or die this time. He felt a little tragic, but he also understood President Qin's actions. If he pretended that nothing had happened, then he didn't deserve to be a child. Yi Liangqiu struggled with all her might, but Kaim used some strength. Miss Yi. Don't forget that you're pregnant. I don't want to hurt you or the child. Yi Liangqiu watched Qin Anlin get into the car in a daze. He left decisively. Other than what he had told Mu Yun, he didn't say anything else. She was held back by Kaim, and tears were already flowing. She had shed all the tears in her life over the past few months. She just looked at his back and mumbled, no, no. She had thought that things wouldn't be so bad if he brought her along, but Anlin was going there with the intention of fighting to the death. No, she had to stop him. Qin Anlin's fingers were on the car door. He paused for a moment, then suddenly turned around and looked at her with his deep eyes. Liangqiu, if your daughter is born, let her surname be Yi. No. Anlin, no. She kept shaking her head as she was held back by Kaim. Qin Anlin just looked at her deeply, then got into the car and left quickly. The cars followed closely behind. Yi Liangxiu's tears didn't stop, and she let out a heart-wrenching cry. Su Shicheng wasn't easy to deal with, or he had already expected it. Kaim, he'll be in danger. Yi Liangxiu's voice trembled. Take me there, take me there. I want to stop everything. Kaim sighed. Miss Yi, President Qin asked me to send you away. She was stunned. Go south. Kaim's voice was filled with helplessness. Including Mu Yun. President Qin has already arranged for someone to send him there. Yi Liangxiu was stunned. All of this was well thought out. He had planned it all out. However, she felt that something was strange. Suddenly, her phone rang. It was a message. As soon as she opened it, her face turned pale. Kaim, I'm sorry, she muttered, then threw the phone at the back of Kaim's head. Kaim's eyes widened as he stared at her in disbelief. Then, his body slumped to the ground. Yi Liangxiu took the car keys from his hand, put her hand on her stomach, and quickly got into the car. Her abdomen hurt a little, but she could only endure it. She reversed the car and drove towards the Su residence. At the Su residence, the two sides were facing each other. Qin Anlin's men surrounded the Su residence. Su Shicheng was helped down from the second floor by the housekeeper. He covered his chest and coughed violently. He was wearing home clothes, and he walked down slowly like an old man who didn't care about worldly affairs. Anlin, what are you doing? Are you going to massacre the Su residents? He went downstairs and was 5 steps away from Qin Anlin, looking calm. Qin Anlin raised his gun at him. How did my mother die? Su Shicheng smiled. You have to ask Liangxiu. She brought Hongke back, didn't she? I'm asking you now. Qin Anlin gritted his teeth. Su Shicheng, do you dare say that you've never seen my mother? Chapter 1590. It's not a doubt, it's a certainty. Qin Anlin said coldly, since you don't want to say it, then maybe you will tell the truth to the gun in my hand after you die. The gun in his hand was loaded, and the crisp sound was exceptionally clear. However, Su Shicheng still smiled calmly looking around. Anlin, bringing 20 to 30 people like this to bully a lonely old man doesn't seem to be a bit justifiable. Su Shicheng wasn't armed at all. He just stood there by himself, looking fearless. I don't want to talk nonsense. Qin Anlin sneered, Su Shicheng, goodbye. But when he pulled the trigger, a person quickly rushed out and pushed Su Shicheng away. The bullet pierced through her palm. Blood splattered and dyed everyone's eyes red. That person was Yi Liangxiu. Her body retreated a few steps and was finally caught by the housekeeper beside Su Shicheng. Blood kept flowing from her hand, but she still did not pass out. She looked at Qin Anlin, who raised the gun again. Anlin, don't shoot. Just now, a picture came from her mobile phone. Qingxiu and Mu Yun were at the airport. However, not far away, there were 2 black-clothed men clearly following them. She believed that if something happened to Su Shicheng, then Mu Yun. She would never see Mu Yun again. She hated Su Shicheng, but she had to save him. She used the stupidest method, because if Qin Anlin still loved her, then only her blood could stop him. Qin Anlin's eyes were bloodshot, and he looked at her, looking at her palm that was shot. That blood made his heart ache, and also made him angry. Liangxiu, get out of the way. I'll kill him and take you to the hospital. Then everything will be over. His voice was cold. He told himself not to be soft-hearted. Yi Liangxiu felt a pain in her lower abdomen, and her palm was in so much pain that she almost lost feeling. Drop by drop, the blood dripped onto the floor and finally converged into a straight line. She pushed away the person who was supporting her and stood in front of Su Shicheng. She smiled bitterly. Anlin, I beg you, let him go. Qin Anlin's Adam's apple kept moving, and his eyes were bloodshot. He stared at her and shouted hoarsely, "Move, or I'll shoot." She stood there with her big belly, her long hair had long been scattered, and she was wearing clothes that did not fit her body. She was in a very sorry state, but there was a kind of despairing beauty. Her beauty made his eyes tinged with a layer of pain. "Are you forcing me?" He narrowed his eyes, looked at her, gritted his teeth, and said word by word. Yi Liangqiu's pupils suddenly shrank, and her mouth heaved up and down violently. "Yes." He closed his eyes. "Yi Liangqiu, do you have a heart?" He pulled the trigger on the gun in his hand. With a bang, a hole was punched through the ceiling. Everyone was shocked, including Yi Liangqiu. Qin Anlin looked at her and smiled pitifully. "Yi Liangqiu, you win." He slowly lowered his hand that was raised high, he turned around and walked towards the door. As he walked, he said calmly, "Next time, I won't be merciful." He did not care about her life or death. Su Shicheng would not let her die. He even pointed at Yi Liangqiu to take the bullet for him. As Qin Anlin thought about it, he laughed self-deprecatingly. How silly. Since when did he trust a woman? Yi Liangqiu looked at his back view, so bleak and lonely. Chapter 1591. The housekeeper wanted to help her into the car, but she pushed her away. Now, she just wanted to look at Anlin. She just wanted to see him one more time. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Anlin, I'm sorry." Su Shicheng's voice rang out quietly. "Have you given up?" Yi Liangqiu desperately restrained herself from fainting from the pain. She held on to her last breath. "I have 2 conditions." Su Shicheng was generous. "Speak." Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips. "I can go back to the Su family. But the child I give birth to must be given to Qin Anlin, and you are not allowed to harm their lives." Her face was as pale as a sheet. Su Shicheng also said lightly, "I also have a condition. Before I die, buy King Entertainment under the name of ATV." He knew that there was no chance for Liangqiu and Qin Anlin, and it would be good to give the child to Qin Anlin, lest the 2 of them break up. Yi Liangqiu looked at him and pursed her lips. Her body was on the verge of collapse. "Is it really that important to you?" Su Shicheng chuckled. "Very important." King Entertainment was Hong Ke's blood and sweat. Taking over King Entertainment was equivalent to taking over half of her life. Moreover, he had defeated Qin Pei. He wanted Qin Pei to lose completely. Su Shicheng's voice was cold and emotionless. "Think about Qin Pei. Before you told Qin Anlin, I could have killed her. Liangqiu, there's no turning back now." Yi Liangqiu's lips curled into a faint smile. She stood in the courtyard of the Su family's house. When she was young, this place had given her so much joy, but now, it was like a cage that made it hard for her to breathe. She looked outside deeply. After a long time, she lowered her eyes. "I promise you." With that, her body finally couldn't take it anymore and she slowly collapsed. Su Shicheng was about to get someone to help her up and send her to the hospital when the gate of the Su family's house was burst open by a black sports car. The car stopped and the door opened. Qin Anlin jumped out of the car and ran to Yi Liangqiu and squatted down. His face was still filled with indignation and unwillingness, but he still carried her. His face was close to hers as he murmured, "Liangqiu, this is the last time." He admitted to himself that no matter how much he hated it, he couldn't let it go. The bullet in her palm had been shot by him. His car had been gone for a minute, and then he was back. He carried her into the car. She slowly opened her eyes and looked at him. He carried her into the car. She slowly opened her eyes and looked at his tense face. She wanted to caress his handsome face with her fingers, but she couldn't lift her hand, and it fell back down. "Anlin." Her lips were extremely dry. She only moved a bit, but no sound came out. She seemed to have exhausted all her strength and could only look at him. But soon, she didn't even have the strength to look at him. She closed her eyes gently. Finally, she didn't have the strength to say sorry. Qin Anlin's face was full of pain. His face was close to hers. But Su Shiqing said softly, Qin Anlin, Liangqiu has made her choice. But Qin Anlin had already carried Yi Liangqiu into the car. He ignored him and didn't get out of the car to point the gun at him. The black sports car sped away and soon disappeared from the Su family's house. Su Shiqing didn't get angry. Instead, he laughed softly. Qin Pei, I didn't expect you to have such an infatuated son. Chapter 1592. The bullet had pierced through her palm and she had lost a lot of blood. At the same time, she had injured a nerve. For the sake of the child, it was best not to put her under anesthesia. Dr. May was under a lot of pressure. She was different from the other doctors. She wanted to save the child the most. At the same time, she discovered the secret in her belly. Yi Liangqiu's uninjured hand grabbed her tightly. Her forehead was covered in sweat. Save them. She felt guilty for the child in her belly, but she had no choice. Su Shiqing's men were watching Mu Yun at the airport. If she didn't do this, Mu Yun would be in danger. Su Shiqing was a lunatic who could do anything. Dr. May looked down at her arm. Yi Liangqiu's hand had almost pierced into her flesh. It was very painful, but Dr. May didn't make a sound. She nodded. Okay. In the end, there was no anesthesia. Dr. May stayed with her. She watched as Yi Liangqiu bit her lips tightly, enduring the piercing pain. She was a doctor, but she couldn't help but be moved. This was a mother's protection for her child. No matter how much pain she was in, she had to leave the best for her child. She loved Anlin very much. That was why she cared so much about the child in her belly. For a full 4 hours, the doctor helped her to take over the tendon. Yi Liangqiu experienced a life worse than death. In the end, she couldn't take it anymore. She opened her eyes and looked at the operating lamp above. She blinked her eyes gently, but her mind was filled with the wedding night with Qin Anlin. That night, her eyes were also red. He held her in his arms, and her long hair was spread on the pillow. Yi Liangqiu smiled gently. She smiled until tears rolled down her cheeks. It was still very painful. It was as if she couldn't feel her hand anymore. Suddenly, there was another wave of sharp pain, and she finally fainted from this wave of pain. It was already 3:00 in the afternoon when she was pushed out of the operating room. The weather outside was not good. The thin sunlight shone weakly into the corridor of the hospital, making it look very bleak. She was pushed out with her eyes closed. If it wasn't for her warmth, he would have thought that she was dead. Yi Liangqiu was sent to the VIP ward. She lay there quietly with her palm wrapped in gauze. Qin Anlin stood upright in front of the bed and stared at her palm. He was the one who shot her. The surgeon said that if her left hand didn't recover well, she might not be able to move. He slowly bent down and held her hand, gently touching it. Lowering his gaze, he stared intently at Zhang Xian. At this point, a hint of warmth could be seen at the corner of his eyes, and tears began to well up. Dr. May watched from the side of the door and said softly, Liangqiu refused to be anesthetized. Although his tone was indifferent, it was more or less imploring. As for the specifics, it was up to Qin Anlin to experience it himself. Qin Anlin looked at her silently for a long time before he slowly straightened his body. What will happen if her hand doesn't heal? Dr. May paused for a moment before she said, I can't take anything. Qin Anlin closed his eyes. I understand. Dr. May wanted to say something but stopped. This child was really lucky. After experiencing such a big storm, she could still sleep soundly. The nurse who did the ultrasound felt that it was unbelievable. She left and let out a deep breath. It was better to let Yi Liangqiu decide for herself. After she left, the tear in the corner of Qin Anlin's eye fell. His fingers gently touched her palm and he noticed that she immediately frowned. Was it very painful? She fell asleep, but she still felt that someone was watching over her. Chapter 1593. Anlin. Anlin. Don't go. She clenched her fists tightly, but her left hand didn't move at all. It just hung there, lifeless. Cold sweat broke out on her forehead, and slowly, it became as big as a bean. Qin Anlin wrung a hot towel to help her wipe the sweat off her forehead, but she was getting hotter and hotter, and the sweat was increasing. She was running a fever. Dr. May came in with a serious expression. Anlin, she should have taken antibiotics after the surgery, but the child in her belly is only 6 months old. Now, what do you think? Qin Anlin pressed his hand on her body, and without hesitation, he said, let her use it. Dr. May wanted to talk to him about the consequences of using the antibiotics, but he interrupted her just as she opened her mouth. His voice was low, and there was a hint of forbearance in it. I said use it. Dr. May sighed. I'll inform the doctor. But she had only taken 2 steps when a weak voice came from behind her. No. Dr. May turned around. Yi Liangqiu hadn't woken up, but she grabbed onto Qin Anlin's arm forcefully with one hand. She shouted unconsciously, don't. Don't. Dr. May's eyes reddened, and she looked at Qin Anlin again. His hand held onto Yi Liangqiu's hand tightly, and he said slowly, why are you so stubborn? He turned his head and looked at Dr. May. As long as she gets through tonight, there won't be a problem. The premise is that her body temperature can't go over 38.5 degrees. Otherwise, it will still affect the fetus, Dr. May said immediately. Qin Anlin closed his eyes. Then let's wait a little longer. Dr. May knew how difficult it was for him to make this decision, so she turned around and said, let's lower the temperature outside the body. She helped him take off the hospital gown. Qin Anlin used warm water to wipe her body over and over again. When he rubbed her little belly, he couldn't help but reach out to touch their child. The child was also gently moving inside, slowly wriggling against his palm. Qin Anlin's facial muscles were trembling. This was their child. Right now, it must also be feeling uneasy and uncomfortable. His palm slowly pacified the child. As if he could feel it, the little guy first swam a little, then kicked a little, and then a little. He looked very happy. If it was in the past, it would be an extremely joyous thing, but now, Qin Anlin couldn't help but bend down and kiss that little belly. Liangqiu, if this is what you want, then I will fulfill your wish. He had nearly killed her and their child. Liangqiu, if you want to go back to the Su family, then go back. I won't stop you. There was a tear in his eyes that dripped down, scalding the little guy. The little thing that was playing in his stomach froze for a moment before sucking his little finger. It seemed like Daddy was crying. Why is Daddy crying? The other little guy ran over and also poked the top. Then the 2 little ones hugged each other. I'm so tired, let's go to sleep. She fell asleep with her head resting on his shoulder. Qin Anlin couldn't feel the fetal movement, so he looked up at Dr. May. Dr. May knew what he was thinking. The child is asleep. It's good that she's asleep. She won't feel uncomfortable when she's asleep. He carefully covered Yi Liangqiu with a thin quilt. Just like that, he wiped her every half an hour for a day and a night. Her body temperature rose to 38 degrees Celsius, but it was under control. Dr. May stayed with her for 10 days. After all, she was old, so she fell asleep on the sofa in the middle of the night. At dawn, Yi Liangqiu's fever finally subsided. Chapter 1594. Qin Anlin sat by the bed and looked at the person on the bed quietly. She was sleeping very deeply and quietly, just like how she used to be. However, she would occasionally furrow her brows as though she was in pain. His fingers caressed her face gently, and his voice was deep and pained. Liangqiu, I hope that you will wake up, but at the same time, I hope that you will sleep like this. This way, you won't leave and won't go against me. When Liangqiu woke up, it was already 10 in the morning. She opened her eyes, feeling a little sore. At first, there was a white fog, and then her vision started to clear up. She was lying on the pillow, and her hand was slowly regaining its feeling and the pain. However, she was still lying there, looking at him and moving her lips. Although her voice was very soft, he still heard the two words, Anlin. Qin Anlin's eyes were a little warm. After a while, he asked mildly, does it hurt? Her hand moved gently and she nodded her head. However, she couldn't bear to look away and kept looking at him. Qin Anlin pursed his lips. I'll call the doctor. With that said, he got up. However, when he took a step forward, his hand was caught. After a long time, he looked down at the hand that was holding him. Liangqiu, this is your own choice. Although he said those heartless words, his voice was trembling slightly. She didn't let go of his hand and held it stubbornly for a long while. Perhaps it was because the more vulnerable she was, the more she needed him. She told herself that this was it. Just let her hold it for a while more. Just a while more. In the end, he still turned around and looked at her face, she still looked at him and looked at his face, not saying a word. He said softly, I'll watch over you, until you get discharged. But Liangqiu, I can only watch over you until then. His gaze was a little gentle, but it was the kind of gentleness that she hadn't seen in a long time, and it broke her heart. It was because he had personally pierced through her hand, and that was how he got that little bit of gentleness. She closed her eyes and didn't say a word for a long time. Qin Anlin stared at her for a while. Finally, he gently withdrew his hand and walked to the door. After calling the doctor, he didn't go in himself. Instead, he smoked a cigarette in the hallway. He needed to calm down so that his heart wouldn't soften. He wouldn't think about forgiving her, and he wouldn't think about getting back together with her. From afar, Kaim came over and stood beside Qin Anlin. He lit a cigarette for himself and pinched the butt before taking a puff. He paused and looked at Qin Anlin. President Qin, I'm sorry. It was because he didn't keep an eye on Liangqiu, which was why things had turned out this way. Kaim blamed herself in her heart. Qin Anlin took a drag on his cigarette. It's none of your business. Once she decided to do something, no one could stop her. Kaim wanted to ask more questions, but Qin Anlin had already put out his cigarette and walked to the ward. Kaim knew in his heart that President Qin still minded it more or less. He scolded himself in his heart. Fuck, I can't even take care of a pregnant woman. When Qin Anlin returned to the ward, the surgeon and Dr. Mei were in the middle of a consultation. After confirming that the child was fine, the surgeon asked Liangqiu to try moving her left hand. But she couldn't move it. She might not have recovered yet. Wait a little longer. Don't move and listen to my instructions, the doctor said calmly. Chapter 1595. Liangqiu was the dream girl for men her age. He remembered how beautiful her hand was on the movie screen. Now, it might be destroyed. The doctor felt that it was a pity, but he still followed the procedure. It would be best if he could save it, but if he couldn't, it would be crippled, and the hand would become a decoration. In fact, the consequences were far worse. The muscles of the hand would shrink in the future. He thought of Venus. The doctor left. Liangqiu lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, not saying a word. The ward was quiet. There was no one else but the two of them. I'll find the best doctors. Qin Anlin said, American, Swiss. They'll definitely cure your hand. He told himself that he was responsible for it. He was the one who pierced it, so he had to take responsibility. But he never dared to think too deeply. His heart ached. He ached for her. If she lost a hand, what would her life be like in the future? Liangqiu, I'd rather fix you up with my own hands and let you stand in front of me in one piece as my enemy. As for the future, I really didn't think about it. Just thinking about it made me unable to accept what I did to you, and I couldn't accept that you would be hurt. I've said that you won. It wasn't because I let my emotions get the better of me, but because I couldn't accept it. In fact, I've already come to terms with you. If not, I would have taken the opportunity to shoot Su Shiqing yesterday. He came to terms with her well-being as his #1 priority. It was just that he was unwilling to tell her these things. He could only bury it in the deepest part of his heart, savoring the bitterness in it. Yi Liangqiu said softly, "Thank you." "Thank you." Qin Yi smiled bitterly. Since when had they become so distant with each other? Actually, it had been a few months since they had been separated. He had sent her to the detention center and pierced her palm. He thought that she must hate him in her heart. At this moment, Kaim knocked on the door and came in with a moisturizer bottle. "I made this myself." His voice was a little hoarse. He probably hadn't slept the whole night. Qin Anlin took it and closed the door. Kaim's nose almost hit the door. He touched his nose and fished out another cigarette. Actually, when he was cooking the porridge, he was thinking, how nice it would be if Su Cheng lived here. Su Cheng was pregnant, and she was the kind of girl who was extremely picky. Now that she was alone in there, could she eat it all? Was the child in her stomach nourished enough? He really fucking wanted to see her. He really wanted to, but he resisted the urge. Since he had seen it, he probably couldn't bear to part with it. Inside the door, Qin Anlin looked at Yi Liangqiu for a while and said lightly, "Have some porridge." Kaim made it. Hearing Kaim's name, Yi Liangqiu finally calmed down. Her eyes met his. "How is he?" "Fortunately, I won't die. With a mild concussion, you can still be a father." His tone was a little harsh. Yi Liangqiu shut her mouth again. Qin Anlin helped her shake the bed a little more and pulled a chair over to sit. His movements were a little stiff as he scooped up a small bowl of porridge. It was just porridge, nothing else. "Just make do with it." He continued to be mean. "I think what you eat in there isn't even as good as this." She looked at his slightly awkward expression and lowered her eyes. "It's still better than this." Qin Anlin glared at her. "Yi Liangqiu, we are enemies now." "I just want to eat better," she said softly, feeling a little aggrieved. Chapter 1596. Qin Anlin looked at her quietly for a long time before he finally smiled lightly. He dialed a number to go out, and she kept looking at him. There was some greed in her gaze, for the last bit of tenderness he had. She knew that she was being shameless. Even now, she still wanted him to treat her well. She was undoubtedly relying on the child in her stomach. Qin Anlin put down the phone in his hand and looked at her deeply. Later. Then there was a moment of silence between the two of them. It was a deathly silence, as if there was nothing more to say. Anything she said would be wrong. He sat on the sofa, seemingly dealing with emails on his phone, while she lay on the sofa, looking up at a 45-degree angle. Fortunately, in less than half an hour, there was a knock on the door. A 5-star chef was standing outside, and behind him were 2 waiters who pushed a dining cart in. "President Qin, these are the nutritious meals you ordered. There are a total of 8 flavors, and they are all light, nutritious, and easy to digest. We will continue to serve you in the afternoon." The chef nodded. "I wish you a pleasant meal." Qin Anlin nodded. After closing the door, he opened the silver lids on the dining cart one by one and asked casually, "What do you want to eat?" Yi Liangxiu pursed her lips. There's no need to be so troublesome. His gaze landed on her face for a long time before he said softly, it's not troublesome. If you want me to do it, it will be troublesome. She quickly realized what he meant. Her expression was a little awkward, but she did not say anything else. He was right. If she wanted him to do it again, it would be troublesome. But now, he could solve it with money, and it was not troublesome. Yi Liangxiu pursed her lips and lay down, allowing him to feed her. He was very patient, feeding her small mouthfuls at a leisurely pace, as if this action could last until the end of time. As Yi Liangxiu ate, his gaze fell on his handsome face. Being able to take a look meant that he was able to take a look. After a long time, she was finally done. Qin Anlin put it away and did not touch the rest, asking the nurse to clean it up. Aren't you going to eat? Her voice was soft. Qin Anlin tilted his head and glanced at her. Miss Yi, you don't need to care about me, just care more about yourself. With just one sentence, her worries and good intentions had been brushed away in an awkward manner. She was not angry. It was only right for him to be like this. It was already a great favor for him to take care of her now. Yi Liangxiu lay on the bed and looked up at the ceiling as usual. They were in an awkward silence again. Qin Anlin sat on the sofa and instinctively wanted to smoke, but in the end, he just clamped it between his fingers. After a long time, he looked up at her. You don't seem worried about your hand. Yi Liangxiu was silent for a moment before saying, there's no point in worrying. Compared to this hand, she had already lost something more precious. What she had to worry about was how to overthrow Su Shicheng in the future. Yes, if she protects the people she wants to protect. She was afraid, but he was with her for the time being. If he wasn't here, she would really be afraid. Anlin, thank you for accompanying me. This sentence that she didn't say out loud made her nose sting. Qin Anlin did not ask her again. He had indeed done his best and even used Tang Yu's connections to invite a large number of foreign experts to come over for a consultation. The results were good but not bad, and it would depend on her recovery later on. Chapter 1597. Yi Liangxiu rejected it without a second thought. She wanted to give birth to the child properly. For a week, her hand was in pain. It was so painful that she couldn't sleep, and she would wake up from time to time at night. When she woke up, she would keep her eyes open until the sun rose. It was a life worse than death, but she continued to endure it. Qin Anlin accompanied her, watched over her, and took care of her. However, he didn't give her a hug. Liangxiu, if this is your choice, then in the future, you have to get used to the days without me. Without my hugs, without my kisses, and without us being together every day. This wasn't a punishment. This was letting go. She woke up from the pain again. It was past 3 in the morning, and it was already the 10th day of her stay in the hospital. She opened her eyes. Under the dim yellow light, she was surrounded by white walls. Qin Anlin was leaning on the sofa in front of the bed, asleep. His chin was pale, and it seemed like he hadn't taken care of himself for the past few days. Yi Liangxiu looked at him quietly for a long time, then got off the bed and squatted in front of him. He had lost a lot of weight, and was even thinner than before. He had taken care of her for the past few days, but he hadn't eaten much. He must be feeling very sad. He hated her, but he had to take care of her. Yi Liangxiu, because you were attached to his gentleness, you were actually cruel to him. It must be very torturous for him to be like this. She pursed her lips and smiled lightly. Her fingers carefully reached out and landed on his handsome brows, tracing the shape of his brows. He frowned, and as if he had sensed something, she immediately let go and held her breath. However, he didn't wake up, and only moved a little. After looking at him for a long time, she finally couldn't control her desire. She leaned forward and kissed him lightly on the lips. It was just a light touch, and she only felt his warm breath, but she left immediately after. She looked up at him deeply, as if she wanted to carve his entire person into her mind, deeply, deeply. Anlin, I have to go. If I stay any longer, it will be a form of harm to you. It will be a form of cruelty. When you see me, you will definitely think of your mother. You will definitely hate me and feel conflicted. I'm leaving. When we meet again, even if it's a bloodbath, even if you hate me to the core, we will have this moment of warmth in our lives. She got up, took the blanket, and gently covered him. She did not care about the tears that were dripping down her cheeks. She just let them fall. When the first ray of sunlight shone into the ward, Qin Anlin moved uncomfortably. His Adam's apple moved, and he slowly opened his eyes. Instinctively, he sat up and grabbed the blanket on his body. Then, he looked at the bed. There was no one there, it was empty. He began calling her name. He searched the bathroom, the kitchenette, the hospital room for her. His heart sank because she was gone. She was gone. Someone knocked on the door. Qin Anlin suddenly turned sideways, his heart beating wildly. He quickly walked over to open the door. But when he opened the door, a 5-star chef was standing outside. President Qin, today's breakfast. There was a defeated look on Qin Anlin's face. After a long time, he sighed softly. Leave it. The door closed. He looked at the sumptuous breakfast and smiled bitterly. He sat down and ate the breakfast that belonged to her bit by bit. As he ate, he looked up to stop his tears from falling. In the end, she still left. In the end, she still made the decision for him. She had always been more ruthless than him. When it was time to break up, she never hesitated. Chapter 1598. Kaim came over with a bouquet of flowers. When he saw the scene in the ward, he was stunned. She left? Don't mention her in the future. She's Su Shiqing's daughter. Qin Anlin clenched the fork in his hand. I'm going to flatten ATV. What Su Shiqing cared about the most was nothing more than his business empire. So, he would flatten ATV, press Su Shiqing's head against the door, and let him see the name of ATV changed with his own eyes. Kaim was stunned for a long time. He stood there without saying a word. He had always thought that things would take a turn for the better, but in the end, they still left. Yi Liangqiu took a taxi back to the Su house. Su Shiqing seemed to have expected her to come back. He was sitting on the sofa looking at a photo album. When he heard the footsteps, he just looked up and said calmly, "You're back." However, his eyes still fell on her left hand. After looking at it for a while, he asked with concern, "How's your hand?" "It might be crippled." Yi Liangqiu's tone was even calmer than his, as if she didn't care. Su Shiqing focused all his attention on her. After a sound of acknowledgement, he got up, and Yi Liangqiu also noticed that the photo album he was looking at was a bit old. Although it was a long time ago, she could still see that it was a photo of Qin Anlin's mother when she was young. He raped someone, causing Lady Qin to commit suicide, and now he was still reminiscing about her affectionately. Suddenly, Yi Liangqiu wanted to vomit. Su Shiqing came over. "Raise your hand." "I can't. I need rehabilitation." Yi Liangqiu looked straight into his eyes. "Or if you think I'm a sacrificial pawn, you can kill me now." Su Shiqing felt a little embarrassed. He sighed softly. "Liangqiu, what are you saying? How can I bear to kill you?" Meeting her cold eyes, he flinched and then said, "I used Mu Yun to threaten you last time because I was afraid that you would be soft-hearted towards Qin Anlin. I didn't really want to hurt Mu Yun. Think about it, he is my grandson. How could I bear to hurt him?" Yi Liangqiu did not say anything. Su Shiqing sighed again. "Even if I make a move, it will at most be a warning. It won't endanger his life. Really? Yi Liangxiu looked at him. You mean, if there's a next time, I won't listen to you because you're bluffing, right? Su Shicheng was embarrassed and annoyed. Liangxiu, this is not good for you. I hope we can keep our promise. Yi Liangxiu's voice was a little cold. Otherwise, I will do something 100 times more tragic than you can imagine. Su Shicheng was stunned for a moment, and then immediately said, of course. After a pause, he said, what you have to do now is to heal the injury on your hand. I need a decent heir. He could no longer host ATV now. Everything depended on Liangxiu. If her hand was not good and she did not have a healthy body, how could she convince the shareholders? It had to be said that Su Shicheng was an extremely utilitarian person. In his eyes, there was only profit. Even if he was dying, he could not change it. I will. Yi Liangxiu looked at him for a while, and then moved her eyes to the album on the table. Can you give this to me? Su Shicheng's body stiffened, and the muscles on his face were even stiffer. He coughed softly. What do you want this for? I miss it. Repent. Yi Liangxiu's voice was calm, but it pierced Su Shicheng's heart like a needle. Chapter 1599. Su Shicheng lowered his head. I'm sorry, Hongke. He got her, but when he did that to her, she only felt pain and humiliation. Until death, she never liked him at all. Su Shicheng felt a little sad, but he was a person who looked forward. Yi Liangxiu sneered, it seems a little hypocritical to say sorry. There's really no need to do this. She picked up the album. Since you have done this, don't you feel disgusted looking at it every day? Su Shicheng was a little annoyed. What was this child saying? But he couldn't do anything about it. At this time, it seemed even more hypocritical to leave the album. He sighed, go and rest, the room is the same one as before. Yi Liangxiu held her belly and slowly went upstairs. She put the album on her bed. Mom, if you know in heaven, you will help me, right? A week later, Yi Liangxiu was sent to a private sanatorium in the United States to recuperate. For a whole 100 days, she stayed alone in the clean ward, thinking about her family in B City with the photos in her phone. After thinking hard, she opened her palm and looked at the bullet mark. There was already a scar there, so faint that it couldn't be seen clearly. She could move her hand, but every time she thought about it, her palm would twitch. She didn't know how many times she would wake up at night and find that she was in a foreign country, not in the sky of B City. Yi Liangxiu opened her eyes and breathed hard, swallowing the bitterness in her heart with every breath. She knew why she was sent to the United States. Because she was pregnant with twins, Su Shicheng didn't want to return both to Anlin. She didn't care, she would protect this child. Most twins were born prematurely. Near the new year, she gave birth to a pair of boy and girl. A boy and a girl, brother and sister. The brother named her Qin Mo, and the sister Yi Mu. When she fed the baby, she would look at Qin Mo more or less, because in the future, she might not see him again. However, Su Shicheng named Yi Mu to be sent to the Qin family, because the Su family needed a boy to carry on the family line. Yi Liangxiu didn't object, it was good for her sister to go back. Daddy would definitely dote on girls more. She sent the child's umbilical cord blood and Xiaoye Mu back to B City and froze them on a private plane. Mu Yun's illness would be cured. She only received a few words from Qin Anlin, saying that he had received Yi Mu. Then, there was nothing else. He should also know of Qin Mo's existence, right? However, he didn't ask. Yi Mu returned to B City and changed his name to Qin Mu, while Qin Mo changed his name to Su Mo. He became Su Shicheng's favorite grandson and the grandson he had placed his hopes on. Yi Liangxiu stayed in New York for almost half a year before returning to B City. At this time, the ATV was already in a precarious situation, leaving her with a mess. On the other hand, King Entertainment was on the rise, pressuring ATV until it couldn't even breathe. Su Shiqing didn't seem to care, only focusing on taking care of his grandson. However, he was also careful not to let his illness affect Su Mo. All day long, he was like a loving grandfather. What Yu Yangqiu didn't expect was that on the first day she went to work at ATV, she would meet Qin Anlin. At the shareholders' meeting, Su Shiqing announced that Yu Yangqiu would become the CEO of ATV, and no one had any objections. No matter how you looked at it, anyone would be better than Su Shiqing. Chapter 1600. After Su Shiqing's announcement, Yu Yangqiu officially took over ATV. Linda, the secretary that Su Shiqing had originally assigned to her, was still her secretary. Yu Yangqiu sat and took care of the mess that Su Shiqing had left behind. Su Shiqing was probably old and unable to do as he wished. Su Shiqing only said that ATV dominated the entertainment industry, but in fact, the company was in a mess. Yu Yangqiu looked at the company's report and frowned. She looked at Linda. Does Mr. Su know that ATV is already in a state of loss? Linda coughed lightly. Mr. Su doesn't ask much. He has high hopes for Mr. Yi. Yu Yangqiu looked at the numbers and sneered. He expects me to lay golden eggs for ATV. A messy company with low-quality artists. It was hard to believe that such a company was ATV, which was on par with King Entertainment. Linda heard her words and couldn't help but laugh. She covered her mouth and endured it. Mr. Su is unable to do as he wishes. Yu Yangqiu looked at her for a long time before asking lightly, "What's on the schedule in the afternoon?" Linda lowered her head, looked at it, and then said, "There's a meeting with the head of King Entertainment in the afternoon." Speaking of this, Linda seemed to be a little hesitant. She paused for a moment before asking, "Mr. Yi, do you need someone else to go?" Yu Yangqiu looked up at Linda and asked slowly, "Are you afraid that I'll feel uncomfortable seeing Qin Anlin?" Linda tacitly agreed. Yu Yangqiu smiled. "It's nothing." She had to show Su Shiqing her results. If she wanted to break through others in one fell swoop, she had to give him some benefits first, let him see hope, and let him think that she had already given in and accepted her fate. Linda was a little surprised. Did Mr. Yi really not care? Thinking about how they hadn't seen each other for more than half a year, what would it be like when they met? Linda was actually looking forward to it. There was really nothing that could stop a woman's heart of gossip. Yu Yangqiu gently flipped through the report in her hand, and her voice was very light. "Linda, you have been with Mr. Su for many years, right?" Linda immediately said, "About 7 or 8 years. As soon as she left school, she entered the ATV. It could be said that the ATV was her home. Although the current situation was not very good, she still could not bear to leave. I think you also know very well that Mr. Su's illness may only be a matter of 2 or 3 years." Yu Yangqiu raised his eyes and looked straight into Linda's eyes. "Linda, you've been working for so many years. I'm sure you know the unspoken rules of the workplace better than I do. I don't think I need to tell you how important it is to take sides, right?" Her tone was neither light nor heavy, but it was enough to shock Linda. Linda was stunned. After a while, she murmured, "Mr. Yi." Yu Yangqiu looked at her. "Of course, you can also choose to be loyal to Mr. Su, or you can be neutral, but the outcome of each choice is different. Think about it." Linda said directly without thinking, "I'll be with Mr. Yi." Yu Yangqiu looked at her and smiled slightly. "Think carefully. Su Shiqing is not that easy to fool. But Mr. Yi will have a way, right?" Linda smiled. "I've thought about it. ATV is like this now. If I don't make a living for myself, it seems like I'll be useless for the rest of my life." Yu Yangqiu looked up at her. "It's good that you have a dream." In fact, Linda was betting that Su Shiqing would not live for long. Chapter 1601. She knew very well that she could only disintegrate Su Shicheng by his side. But she wouldn't tell Linda this. Go and prepare the information, she ordered lightly. Linda got a new master, nodded and left. When she went out, she still felt a little uneasy. Just then, her cell phone rang. She picked it up hesitantly, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Mr. Su, nothing happened. It's quite normal." She hung up and went all the way back to her office. After entering, she saw a little rabbit on the table. It was a gift from Mr. Yi. It was quite cute, so she put it on the desk. Linda lowered her head and didn't notice that there was something special about the little rabbit's eyes. And this was a trick that Su Cheng used to play. Yi Liangxiu found it in Su Cheng's room and gave it to Linda. From now on, she couldn't trust anyone. At 2:00 in the afternoon, Yi Liangxiu drove a white BMW by herself, and Linda was next to her. Linda looked at her hand holding the steering wheel and was a little worried. "Mr. Yi, your hand. Are you okay? Why don't I drive?" Yi Liangxiu smiled lightly. "It's completely healed." But when she thought of Qin Anlin, she would still feel a faint throbbing pain. That place seemed to have a memory of him. Although it was painful, she could endure it. Linda replied with an "oh," and didn't say anything else. As Yi Liangxiu drove, Linda said, "This time, ATV wants to buy the 40-episode TV series produced by King Entertainment. King Entertainment is asking for 300 million yuan for the package, but we haven't relented. It's a small investment of tens of millions, but it's asking for an exorbitant price. Moreover, the female lead is unknown. Mr. Su didn't think it was worth more than 150 million yuan. Although ATV was not doing well internally, its primetime TV series had always been doing well, and its advertisers were also top brands. As long as this was done well, ATV could at least survive for 5 years. Yi Liangxiu held the steering wheel and asked lightly, "Who are the main actors?" Linda had prepared the documents, but she had not looked at them in detail. She had planned to talk about it in the car, and she could not make a decision immediately today. Linda took out the documents and said faintly, "The female lead is played by a woman named Xia Mian." The male lead, before she could finish, the car screeched to a stop. Linda was shocked. "Mr. Yi?" Yi Liangxiu paused for a long time without moving. After a long time, she softly said, "Say it again, who played the female lead?" Linda looked at her cautiously. "Xia Mian." "Mr. Yi, is there anything wrong?" Yi Liangxiu let out a long sigh. "Go on." She stepped on the accelerator and got the car back on the road. Linda, on the other hand, was much more cautious. She was good at reading people's expressions, and she soon realized that Mr. Yi seemed to care about this female artist named Xia Mian. Although he didn't say anything, Mr. Yi was unhappy. Linda was a little depressed, and she didn't say anything after she finished speaking. "Got it." Yi Liangxiu's voice was faint. After a long silence, she said, "I know Xia Mian." "Ah." Linda was stunned. Yi Liangxiu smiled gently. How could she not know her? When she and Qin Anlin got married, Xia Mian appeared in front of them like sticky candy, and every time she appeared, she would look delicate and pitiful. She was a real white lotus flower. However, she didn't know if Xia Mian had climbed into Qin Anlin's bed. Her heart was heavy, and she couldn't express her sadness. Chapter 1602. The white BMW was parked downstairs. Yi Liangxiu and Linda walked into room 1202, which had been booked in advance. The people from King Entertainment had already arrived. There were only Qin Anlin and Kaim. The small number of people surprised her. Yi Liangxiu stood by the door, her body stiff. After all, they hadn't seen each other for more than half a year. Her heart trembled slightly, and she didn't dare to look at him for a long time. Qin Anlin just stood up politely. He was thinner and thinner, and his whole body was full of alienation. Mr. Yi, he greeted indifferently, as if he was talking to a stranger. Yi Liangxiu lightly pursed her lips and lightly greeted him as well. She walked over and sat across from them. Linda carefully sat to the side. Qin Anlin lit a cigarette, took a drag, and asked, "You don't mind if I smoke, do you?" She looked at him and then at the dozen or so cigarette butts in the ashtray. Had he been here for a long time? Her voice was slightly stiff as she said, "If you mind, President Qin won't smoke." Mr. Yi always likes to tell the truth. Qin Anlin smiled faintly, but there wasn't the slightest hint of a smile in his eyes. Beside them, Kaim sighed inwardly. Why did they have to kill each other as soon as they met? They missed each other so much when they couldn't see each other. Su Shicheng was really shrewd. She hadn't seen him recently, and she couldn't find him even if she wanted to kill him. However, President Qin seemed to have let him go for now. He didn't do anything and just lived in peace. As Qin Anlin said this, Yi Liangxiu felt a fishy sweetness in her throat, and there was an indescribable feeling in her heart. Just then, the door opened, and a slender figure walked in. When Yi Liangxiu saw who it was, she was stunned. It turned out to be Xia Mian. And she also knew the person behind her. It was Ying Jie. Xia Mian probably didn't expect to see Yi Liangxiu either. She froze in place. She looked at Qin Anlin, and then at Yi Liangxiu, her lips pursed into a straight line. Kaim coughed lightly. "Mr. Yi of ATV, this time, your TV series is going to be aired in ATV's prime time slot." Xia Mian nodded, then smiled at Yi Liangxiu. "Thank you, Mr. Yi." It seemed that Xia Mian had learned a lot about the ways of the world in the past 6 months. If it were in the past, she wouldn't have been able to do this. Yi Liangxiu didn't speak to her. Instead, he greeted Sister Ying. "Long time no see. Let's have a meal together when you're free." Sister Ying was not bashful at all. She said straightforwardly, "Okay, let's make an appointment later." No matter what the current situation was, Yi Liangxiu was still the brightest star in her hands. Xia Mian was a little unhappy with Ying Jie's behavior. Ying Jie was her agent now, so how could she side with an outsider? So she said unhappily, "Ying Jie, we're going to Korea in 2 days, so we might not have time." Ying Jie was naturally unhappy with her insensible behavior. She was only her agent, not a nanny. Plus, Xia Mian hadn't grown up yet, and if she kept pressuring her like this, things would get out of hand in the future. Ying Jie hadn't been in the entertainment industry for so many years for nothing. She smiled faintly. "Little Yi can go with you." Yi Liangxiu could naturally tell that Ying Jie felt unfair for her, so she smiled and didn't say anything. Xia Mian was a little embarrassed, but in front of Qin Anlin, she didn't dare to act rashly. Qin Anlin put out the cigarette in his hand, looked at Yi Liangxiu quietly, and said in a businesslike manner, "Mr. Yi, let's talk about the contract." As he spoke, he lit another cigarette. Just as he was about to smoke, Xia Mian coughed lightly. Qin Anlin's fingers paused, but he still put out the cigarette. Chapter 1603. Qin Anlin put out his cigarette. His gaze fell on Yi Liangxiu's face for a few seconds before he quietly looked away. He leaned back and looked at Kaim. "Show the sample to Mr. Yi." Kaim nodded. He got up and opened a file on his computer. He placed it next to Yi Liangxiu. "Mr. Yi, this is the first episode. All the samples are here. You can take a good look at them before you decide." At that moment, Xia Mian sat where Kaim had been sitting. She turned her body sideways and looked at it as well. This way, almost half of her body was pressed against Qin Anlin's arm. However, Qin Anlin didn't move away. He still sat there quietly, his gaze indifferent. Yi Liangqiu naturally saw it too. She could even see Xia Mian leaning forward and revealing a little of her skin. Whether Qin Anlin did it intentionally or not, he could see it. She tried her best not to look at it. Instead, she focused on the sample in front of her. The beginning of the sample was quite beautiful. The female lead stood in a soft light and smiled at the camera. Then, there was a narration. After so many years, I still haven't forgotten him. After watching it for a short while, Yi Liangqiu had to admit that Xia Mian was a natural actress. She had a strong sense of the camera. The story after that was very youthful. It was about a young man and a woman in love. Xia Mian was very young, so she easily got the role. She played the female lead in Summer Solstice, Midsummer. Yi Liangqiu watched it for about 20 minutes. Then, she watched the other episodes. They were well made and very good. She immediately decided to buy it. She smiled. Why do you want to broadcast it on ATV? Before Qin Anlin could speak, Xia Mian was young and competitive. She spoke first. We don't have to broadcast it on ATV. It's just that President Qin is still the same. Yi Liangqiu looked at her and then shifted her gaze to Qin Anlin. She asked calmly, does Miss Xia have any position in King Entertainment? Qin Anlin looked at Xia Mian and said, Xia Mian just expressed her opinion. Yi Liangqiu smiled. Then we can't talk anymore, President Qin. She looked straight at him and said in a slightly domineering tone, I'm not a person who will compromise. If the other party, a small artiste, dared to point fingers at her and be disrespectful, then she could forget about being Mr. Yi of ATV. As he spoke, he closed the laptop. Goodbye, President Qin. Linda, who was at the side, was stunned. Boss has such a bad temper. However, she was a professional secretary, so she quickly packed up her things and left with Yi Liangqiu. As soon as she walked to the door, Qin Anlin's deep voice came from behind her, Xia Mian, apologize. What? Xia Mian looked at Qin Anlin in disbelief. He actually wanted her to apologize. Did she do something wrong? Why did he want her to apologize? It was Yi Liangqiu who couldn't distinguish between work and threw a tantrum. Why was she the one to apologize in the end? She didn't want it. Qin Anlin said it again in a deep voice. This time, he was more strict. Xia Mian was shocked, but she still apologized. She couldn't ruin everything she had worked hard for. Summer Solstice, Xia Mian was the female lead in the audition. She had defeated thousands of girls to get this role. And this wasn't the original name of the show. In the end, one word was changed, because her name was Xia Mian, the scriptwriter changed it in the end. President Qin also agreed. She thought that President Qin's action was because he liked her, or at least it had some deeper meaning. Chapter 1604. She had worked hard for the show, and the director, screenwriter, and even the original author all said that she acted well. Why was it that when it came to Yi Liangqiu, it was worthless? She didn't want to give up her efforts, so she reluctantly apologized, Mr. Yi, I'm sorry. Yi Liangqiu turned around and looked at her sharply, Miss Xia, I think you know better than anyone else that ATV's primetime has made many actresses famous. No matter how bad ATV is, they won't beg to buy a newcomer's show. Her aura was so strong that Xia Mian was suppressed. Xia Mian didn't understand Yi Liangqiu's intention. Was this woman trying to suppress her? For a long time. Xia Mian said in a low voice, I'll listen to President Qin's arrangements. She finally knew where she was wrong. However, from this incident and Xia Mian's reaction, she knew that she and Qin Anlin weren't that close. And Qin Anlin's action of putting out the cigarette seemed a bit deliberate. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and slowly walked back. She held the edge of the table with both hands and looked straight at Qin Anlin. President Qin asked her to apologize, so she won't sell ATV. Is that what you mean? Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes and played with the lighter in his hand with his slender fingers. Mr. Yi is so sure. Yi Liangqiu grunted, 150 million, I won't add a single cent. Then she paused again. The decision to cooperate or not is in President Qin's hands. To be honest, 150 million is a cheap price for this production. But she's holding Xia Mian back, because all the major TV stations are busy showing spy dramas, and their schedules are full. They don't have time to show youth films. ATV's primetime has always been the first choice for youth films. She understood this fact, and Qin Anlin understood it even more. Only Xia Mian didn't know. Qin Anlin's fingers paused, and then he smiled faintly, okay. Obviously, Xia Mian couldn't accept it. One had to know that the investment for this drama was 100 million, and that did not include the actors' salaries. It was not profitable at all. In her eyes, Yi Liangqiu was a bloody steamed bun. She exclaimed, President Qin. Qin Anlin gave her a stern look, and Xia Mian didn't dare to say anything. Ying Jia, who had been watching all this while, thought to herself that he was so petty and didn't know what was important. If President Qin didn't earn money to support her, she would feel that it was a loss. Now, Liangqiu was the one who felt bad in her heart. She seemed to have gotten a bargain, but she must be disappointed. In the past, President Qin had helped her like this. How could she not feel bad facing Xia Mian? Kaim handed over the contract. Yi Liangqiu read it once and asked Linda to read it again carefully. It took them about an hour to read the contract. Xia Mian was a little bored, so she sat on the sofa and played with her cell phone. Qin Anlin sat by the table, his expression impeccable, and his eyes fell on Yi Liangqiu's face and her hand. Her hand was very flexible. It was obvious that she had recovered. Just looking at her face made his Adam's apple move uncontrollably. He unbuttoned 2 buttons to hide it. Yi Liangqiu was unaware of all this. She just finished reading the contract and looked up. Let's sign the contract of intent first. What, Mr. Yi still wants to show off after getting a bargain? Qin Anlin's voice was low and hoarse, and only he knew that when he looked at her, he couldn't control his body, which hadn't been excited for a long time. Chapter 1605. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. President Qin, you're being too serious. It's never a bad thing to be careful. Qin Anlin looked at Kaim. Kaim immediately took out the initial document. I'm ready. Is it ready now? Qin Anlin's voice was a little hoarse, and his eyes fell on her face coldly. Yi Liangqiu signed her name with a faint smile. Then, Qin Anlin also signed his name. After signing, Yi Liangqiu put away her contract and smiled. President Qin, it's been a pleasure working with you. Qin Anlin held her fingers and didn't let go for a long time. She struggled and looked at his face. President Qin. Qin Anlin suddenly let go of her hand, turned around, and walked out. When he let go of her hand, she clearly felt a sense of loss. The feeling of being let go was like yesterday. Xia Mian got up from the sofa and walked to the door. Suddenly, she turned around and looked at Yi Liangqiu. Yi Liangqiu, you left his life a long time ago. Why did you come back? She even showed a victorious look and left proudly. Yi Liangqiu looked down and chuckled. Ying Jia walked over and sighed. Don't argue with her. She's just a little girl. She paused for a moment. She likes President Qin, but there's nothing between President Qin and her. Don't think too much about it. There's no use thinking about it. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly. Ying Jia, thank you. Ying Jia didn't know what to say, so she had to make another appointment. Linda packed up her things and came over. She gathered up her courage. Mr. Yi, do you still love him? She was scared to death just now. The sparks between Mr. Yi and President Qin were too strong. It was like fireworks, full of sparks, and Xia Mian was like cannon fodder. Yi Liangqiu looked at Linda and smiled. Maybe. The two of them walked out together. Linda said as she walked, Mr. Yi is really amazing. We couldn't come to an agreement before. It's not that I'm powerful, it's that they want to sell it. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly, but her smile was somewhat bitter. 150 million yuan might seem like a loss, but if they made Xia Mian famous, the business value would be much more than that. When Qin Anlin promoted someone, he was always willing to spend a lot of money. Linda had seen it many times, so she immediately understood. She paused and said hesitantly, obviously, Xia Mian's EQ isn't high enough. It depends on how you package it. Yi Liangqiu smiled faintly and went to the car to open the door. Just as she was speaking, an arm suddenly pulled her back. Her body was pressed against the car, and in front of her was Qin Anlin's face. Beside her, Linda was stunned. She clenched the documents in her hands tightly. Was this a robbery? You go first. Qin Anlin squeezed out a few words. Linda looked at him in horror. What was he going to do to Mr. Yi? Was he going to kill him first? Holding the briefcase, Linda wanted to cry. She had just found a new master. If she ran away now, wouldn't she be going back on her word? Therefore, Linda boldly hit Qin Anlin with the briefcase. Let go of our Mr. Yi. Qin Anlin's body stiffened. With one hand pressing down on Yi Liangqiu, he turned his head and looked at Linda. How dare you hit me when you're so timid? What do you think I want to do? Qin Anlin's voice was deep. Up until now, Yi Liangqiu is still my wife. What do you think I want to do? Chapter 1606. There was no one around. Linda felt that if she fought like this, even with the help of Mr. Yi, they wouldn't be a match for this man. So, Linda backed down. She lifted her skirt and ran quickly. Mr. Yi, I'll go back to the company first. Yi Liangqiu looked at her back, and ran away with a whoosh. She felt a little helpless and turned her head to look at Qin Anlin in front of her. President Qin, do you want to catch up? Her body was pressed against the car door by him and she couldn't move, but she didn't struggle. They were very close, but their faces were 20 centimeters apart. Qin Anlin's eyes fell on her face. After looking at it for a long time, he said softly, You're willing to come back. Half a year ago, she asked someone to send little Qin Mu back, and she stayed in New York for half a year. At that time, he only knew that she was pregnant with twins, and they had a son named Su Mo Su Shirching's surname. After saying that, he stared at her face, not letting go of any expression on her face. If I could, I also want to never come back. She smiled bitterly and finally pushed him away and stood up straight. If she didn't come back, she wouldn't have to suffer, and she wouldn't have to face everything. Su Mo looked very much like Anlin. Every time she saw Xiao Xiao's face, she couldn't help but think of Qin Anlin. Then why did you come back? He stood quietly, took out a cigarette, and lit it quietly. He looked at her. You don't want to see me, and you want to avoid me, don't you? Yi Liangqiu's gaze fell on his face. After a long time, she smiled. Qin Anlin, what if the current me is different from the previous me? She paused for a moment. Thousands of ATV employees have to eat. I didn't expect Mr. Yi to be so kind. Qin Anlin sneered. Don't you know that ATV is at the end of its road? Really? She smiled faintly. Then why is the drama, Summer Solstice, still being broadcast on ATV? ATV's bad situation was internally, and the ratings were not bad. Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes and leaned to the side. Does Mr. Yi mind? His gaze was almost piercing as he looked at her. What do you mind? Yi Liangqiu smiled. Do you mind if you flatter Shemian? He didn't say anything. He just looked at her. Yi Liangqiu looked into the distance and then looked at him. If you need my signature one day, you can look for me. As soon as she finished speaking, her body was pressed down by him once more, his back hit the car door, and his bones hurt. Sign. He pressed her, his face close to hers. Yi Liangqiu, what do you want to sign? He deliberately hurt her. She could even hear the bones in her back cracking. Yi Liangqiu, as soon as you come back, you want to talk about divorce with me, don't you? He stared at her angrily. Don't you miss Mu Yun at all? Don't you miss Mumu at all? She was in so much pain that she closed her eyes. After a long time, she squeezed out a few words. Will you let me see him? He looked at her. It had been almost a year, but she hadn't changed at all. She was still as hateful as before. When he was angry, she could be so calm. He wondered if she had a heart. No. He sneered. Do you regret it? Yi Liangqiu closed her eyes. Qin Anlin, do you have to do this? If she knew him, she would know that this was already the most gentle way he could. Qin Anlin's gaze fell on her face. Just as he was about to say something, a weak voice came from behind him. President Qin, Kim asked me to come and call you. Chapter 1607. Qin Anlin tilted his head and looked at Xia Mian. Yi Liangqiu also opened her eyes. Her gaze fell on Qin Anlin's face and she smiled faintly. Yeah, President Qin's car is waiting for you. The air seemed to freeze. Qin Anlin's voice was deep. Get out. Xia Mian thought he was talking about Yi Liangqiu, so she smiled triumphantly. Yi Liangqiu pushed him away and wanted to open the car door. Did I allow you to leave? Suddenly, her wrist was grabbed, and she bumped into a Hun's chest. Her lips were kissed. She opened her eyes wide and looked at his enlarged face. Qin Anlin was angry. Rather than a kiss, it was more like a punishment. He kissed her lips fiercely and rubbed them, her back bumped against the car door with a loud thud. He held her whole body in his arms. His fingers pinched her chin, and he took advantage of her weakness. She hadn't been kissed by him for a long time, so she wasn't used to it. Her head shook violently and she struggled. But he didn't let her go. He used brute force to hold her head in place and moved away slightly. His breathing was a bit messy. Yi Liangqiu, who allowed you to leave? He kissed her so fiercely that he almost bit off a layer of her skin. Xia Mian, who was beside them, was stunned. She just watched them entangle. She thought that President Qin treated her differently, but now she knew that there was no difference. Yi Liangqiu was the one who was different. Yi Liangqiu was the one who could irritate him and control his emotions. Xia Mian stared at them for a long time and finally left. Qin Anlin kissed for a full 5 minutes before he stopped. Both of them were breathless and looked a bit embarrassed. Yi Liangqiu turned her face away, not wanting to look at him. The lipstick on her lips was eaten by him. They were even slightly swollen, but they were redder than usual. Qin Anlin wasn't any better. His lips were peeled off several times. He looked up, took a step back and looked at her deeply. After a long time, he laughed at himself and said, Mr. Yi, I've offended you. He took another 2 steps back and watched her fall against the car door. He remembered how beautiful she was when she was lying on his bed. Right now, even in this kind of place, in this kind of mess, she was still as beautiful as a painting. He was poisoned by her. He wanted to quit, but Liangqiu, he couldn't. My insomnia relapsed, but I didn't want to treat it, because I knew it couldn't be cured. Medicine has never been able to cure me. Qin Anlin left. Her body finally collapsed, and she slowly squatted down. Her legs were soft, her body was weak, and even her spirit was trembling. Her fingers slowly touched her swollen lips. His scent still lingered on them. The wild tension when he took her. After a long time, she finally got into the car. She wanted to drive, but her legs didn't have any strength. She opened her palm. There was a faint mark on it. It was very, very painful. Yi Liangxiu called Linda later, and Linda came over to take her back to ATV. After the relevant department of ATV saw the sample film, they were very optimistic about the film, Summer Solstice, Summer Sleep, and wanted to schedule it immediately. Wait a little longer. Yi Liangxiu thought for a moment and said, this won't be the only move King Entertainment is making. Xia Mian will definitely have other opportunities to be exposed. Linda hesitated for a moment. Mr. Yu wants to suppress this film. When Xia Mian's value is high, there will be a lot of advertisers coming to sponsor her. Chapter 1608. Linda looked at Yi Liangxiu with a creepy look. Mr. Yi. You're so two-faced. Yi Liangxiu's reaction was indifferent. Have you forgotten what I used to do? Linda was stunned. Then she remembered that Yi Liangxiu was a pop queen. Xia Mian, a small star, couldn't compare to her. Years ago, at one of Yi Liangxiu's fan conferences, more than 10 people fainted, and one of them was even in a coma. She knew the rules of the entertainment industry better than anyone else. Linda asked worriedly, will King Entertainment be put in a difficult position? Yi Liangxiu sat behind her desk and took a sip of the tonic she brought from home. Her voice was indifferent. This isn't within King Entertainment's rights. She looked at Linda. Qin Anlin isn't omnipotent. Go and find out what Xia Mian is doing recently. What films will she be showing? Linda nodded. Yes, Mr. Yi. Linda went to make a few calls. She knew people at King Entertainment. After making the calls, she came back. Mr. Yi, I found it. In a month, Xia Mian will be watching a show at the Paris Fashion Show, and King Entertainment is talking about endorsements. She's talking about endorsements without even having any works. She's really trying to promote herself. Yi Liangxiu sneered. She wants to ride on ATV. She's dreaming. Linda's eyes sparkled. Mr. Yi thinks far ahead. Yi Liangxiu looked down. She's signed a contract. Keep it a secret and don't show it for now. Linda nodded. Xia Mian will definitely be popular, but it depends on how much ATV benefits from this. Yi Liangxiu clenched her fists, feeling the pain in her palms. After a while, she smiled. I'm going back first. Linda was suddenly interested. Are you going back to feed Momo? Yi Liangxiu smiled. He should break up too. However, this child was very clingy and refused to let go. Normally, she would go back early to feed him. Thinking of Momo, she thought of her other two children, Mu Yun and little Mumu. Yi Liangxiu was silent for a while before she smiled and stood up. Linda saw loneliness in her smile. She knew about the entanglement between Mr. Yi and Qin Anlin, but she didn't know why they separated. They were a good couple, but now they met, they were even worse than strangers. Moreover, looking at CEO Qin tonight, he was like a wolf. She didn't know if CEO Yi had been eaten. Linda didn't dare to ask and watched Yi Liangxiu walk out. When Yi Liangxiu drove back to the Su house, she played an episode of a recent popular drama, Because of One Person. Abandoning a city because of one person. I think I have found the balance of love. I am still me, as if I have never left. This city had trapped a lonely soul. Scars all over the ground were the proof of blood. That person opened the locked city gate, melting the cold, accompanying me between heaven and earth, because of a city. Losing a person. At the end of love, no one wins. Infinite playback. There was a touch of moisture in her eyes. She didn't know when, but her face was already cold. She reached out and wiped it. It was actually tears. Yu Yangqiu, what's going on? Why do your legs feel weak when you think of him? You chose this path. Why did you become weak before you even started? There was a turn in front of her, and a car was coming this way. Her car had already deviated from her lane. She should have stepped on the brakes, but her legs were very weak. She could only watch the car crash towards her. Chapter 1609. Yi Liangqiu lay on her stomach for a long time before she opened her eyes. She looked out of the car window at the daytime. Her eyelids closed weakly and opened again. Finally, she fell into darkness. There was a commotion all around, and people surrounded her. The front of the white BMW was almost smashed, and the owner lay motionless on the steering wheel. Before the ambulance arrived, the reporters had arrived and were scrambling to report on the car accident. Soon, according to the license plate, the owner was Yi Liangqiu from ATV. Yi Liangqiu was not only a senior executive of ATV, but also a legend in the entertainment industry. Therefore, the financial section and entertainment section filled the pages for 2 days, and the news of Yi Liangqiu's car accident was everywhere. In the news, Yi Liangqiu was carried on a stretcher to the ambulance. Her hands were hanging, and her vital signs could not be seen. A large number of entertainment reporters followed behind, scrambling to report on it. Qin Anlan's face was livid as he looked at the scene in front of him gloomily. Kaim stood at the side, not daring to breathe loudly. There was a dead silence in the air. After a long time, Kaim asked carefully, "President Qin, do you need me to go and take a look?" "No." Qin Anlan answered quickly. After a while, he picked up a cigarette and took 2 drags. Of course, he coughed violently. After a long time, he looked at Kaim and said, "Letting Jie go." Kaim nodded and went. Jie went to the hospital but did not see her. Yi Liangqiu did not have any external injuries. After a series of ultrasound and a series of CT scans, there were no problems inside or out, but she did not wake up. The doctor said that there was definitely a concussion, but she would not have been unconscious for so long. Jie waited until midnight and had to come back to report. Qin Anlan was still sitting in the president's office, and the cigarette butts in the ashtray on the table were piled up like a small hill. Jie pushed the door open and came in. She had worked for him for many years, so she spoke bluntly. "Why do you smoke so much?" Thus, he went in, opened the curtains, poured out the cigarette butts, and cleaned them up. Qin Anlan lit another cigarette. His voice was so hoarse that it was almost indiscernible. "How is she?" "He's not awake yet." Jie came over and snatched the cigarette from his hand. "That's nothing. If you care about her, go and take a look yourself. She's lying there half dead anyway. If you hesitate any longer, you might be able to attend the funeral tomorrow." Jie's words were quite vicious, but each word struck a chord in his heart. Qin Anlan looked up. Jie's back was facing the light, so he couldn't see the expression on her face. She continued, "President Qin, I missed someone. I always thought that he should be the one to speak first, but in the end, he didn't even say a word of love to me. That person was Kaim. The child that Su Cheng gave birth to had been sent out. Kaim's mother liked the little girl very much. She hugged the little girl all day long and refused to let go. However, she still hadn't let go of the matter between Su Cheng and Kaim. Kaim wasn't in a hurry. Jie had always known that Kaim had some tricks up his sleeves. Su Cheng's performance was good, and her sentence had been reduced to 20 years. Perhaps it would be reduced in the future. Kaim continued to wait stubbornly. Mama, he introduced him to several teachers, but Kaim just met them. There was no future. Kaim continued to wait stubbornly, and she was also stubbornly watching, waiting to see when he would give up. Qin Anlin's eyes were a little bloodshot. In a sense, Ying Jia was his bosom friend. Chapter 16:10. But Ying Jia, I'm different from you. He sighed. I can do anything, but I can't get over my mother's matter. Ying Jia could understand, but she believed in Yu Yangqiu's difficulties more. After a moment of silence, she said, just take it that she's Mumu and Mu Yun's mother. Let's go and have a look. Qin Anlin closed his eyes slightly, and his Adam's apple kept moving. After a long time, he sighed softly. You go back first. Ying Jia wanted to say something, but in the end, she didn't say it. She walked out of the door for him. She thought that the truth would come to light one day. She had raised Yu Yangqiu all the way, so she knew that child very well. Qin Anlin raised his hand and looked at his watch. It was already 1:00 in the night. He turned on the computer again and watched the news over and over again. He watched it like a masochist for about 10 times. He slammed his fingers on the laptop, picked up his coat, and walked to the door. When he opened the door, he saw Xia Mian squatting by the door. Seeing him come out, she raised her head. The expression on her face was a little stubborn, and there were stars in her eyes. She looked very much like Liu Yangqiu 8 years ago. Qin Anlin was stunned for a moment. After a long time, he pursed his lips, ignored her, and walked straight to the elevator. Xia Mian chased after him and clasped his arm. President Qin. Qin Anlin had already stepped into the elevator, and Xia Mian followed him. Are you going to see Mr. Yi, President Qin? There was impatience in Qin Anlin's eyes. After a long time, he suppressed his voice and said, Miss Xia, you've crossed the line. Of course, Xia Mian knew that the reason why she was like this was that she looked a little like Yu Yangqiu. She clearly knew why President Qin took her there today. It was just to stimulate Yu Yangqiu. And she had been waiting for a chance to replace Yu Yangqiu. Not only did she have to replace Yu Yangqiu in the entertainment industry, she also had to replace her identity at King Entertainment. President Qin, I'm just worried about you. Xia Mian pursed her pretty lips. Dressed in a white dress, she looked like the heroine in a movie called The Most Beautiful Girl in School. I don't need your concern. Qin Anlin's voice was deep. Don't challenge my patience again and again, or you will know the consequences. Xia Mian sneered inwardly. Had he not thought, when he was using her, that he was giving her hope? The elevator door opened, and Qin Anlin walked out. Xia Mian paused for a long time before following him out. Qin Anlin sat in the car and started the car, but it didn't start for a long time. He slammed his hand on the steering wheel, and a sharp sound rang out. Then, all the cars in the parking lot screeched. He grabbed his hair in frustration, got out of the car, and walked to the side of the road to hail a taxi. It was late at night, and there was not a single car on the street. He was about to call the driver when a small white Shimei drove over. The window was rolled down, and Xia Mian's expression was cautious. President Qin, do you want me to drive you there? Qin Anlin looked at the empty street and finally got in the car. Xia Mian drove steadily, but her car was too small, and it seemed even smaller when he sat in it. While driving, Xia Mian looked at the rearview mirror and said softly, my car is small, so it might not be comfortable. Qin Anlin ignored her. Xia Mian was rebuffed, so she didn't say anything else and drove to see City General Hospital. You're tuning into the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.